I'm Marcus Rivera, 42 years old, and after spending 15 years behind bars for a murder I didn't commit, I thought my life was over. In 2009, I was convicted of killing my business partner David Martinez during what prosecutors called a heated financial dispute. The evidence seemed ironclad: my fingerprints on the murder weapon, witness testimony placing me at the scene, and David's body found in my warehouse. I maintained my innocence through every appeal, every sleepless night in my cell, watching my family abandon me one by one. My wife divorced me, my children grew up without their father, and my mother died believing her son was a killer. But on March 15, 2024, during my final appeal hearing, the courtroom doors opened and a man walked in who would shatter everything everyone thought they knew about my case. The man they said I murdered, David Martinez, was standing right there, very much alive. What happened next would expose a conspiracy so deep that it destroyed multiple lives and revealed the truth about who really wanted me gone. But let me take you back to where it all began, because understanding how I ended up in that courtroom requires knowing the friendship that once meant everything to me. David Martinez and I met during our sophomore year at Arizona State University. We were both studying business, both working part-time jobs to pay for school, and both dreamers who talked endlessly about starting our own company someday. David was the kind of guy who could make friends with anyone, charming, quick with a joke, always the life of the party. I was more serious, the planner, the one who actually read the fine print and worried about details. After graduation in 2003, we kept our promise to each other. Rivera and Martinez construction started in my garage with a borrowed pickup truck, some basic tools, and a business partnership agreement we drafted ourselves using legal forms from the internet. That document, the original business partnership agreement dated March 15, 2008, would later become Exhibit A in my trial. But back then, it represented hope. 50-50 split on everything. Equal partners in every sense. Those early years were magical. We specialized in custom home renovations, and our reputation grew quickly in the Phoenix suburbs. David had the personality that drew clients, while I managed the numbers and made sure projects finished on time and under budget. By 2008, we were pulling in over $2 million annually. We'd made it. Our families became intertwined in the way that only happens with true friendship. Jennifer and I would host barbecues where David would bring his wife Maria and their twin daughters, Sophia and Carmen. Our kids played together. Ashley was the same age as the twins, and little Michael adored David, who always brought him small toys and treated him like his own nephew. David became Michael's godfather at his baptism, and I stood up as best man at David's wedding. We took family vacations together to Rocky Point, Mexico, renting side-by-side beach houses and spending long evenings around fire pits, talking about expanding the business, maybe opening a second office in Tucson. David would strum his guitar while the kids roasted marshmallows, and Maria would laugh at his terrible singing. Those were the happiest times of my life. The first crack in our perfect partnership appeared in late 2008, right around the time the economy started crashing. David began showing up late to job sites, sometimes with bloodshot eyes and coffee-stained clothes that looked like he'd slept in them. At first, I attributed it to stress. We all felt the pressure as construction contracts became harder to secure. But then Jennifer mentioned seeing David at the casino on a Tuesday afternoon when he was supposed to be meeting with suppliers. When I confronted him about it, David laughed it off, just blowing off steam. "Marcus, you worry too much." But the missing invoices and unexplained cash withdrawals from our business account told a different story. 5,000 here, 3,000 there, always with explanations that almost made sense but never quite added up. The gambling addiction became impossible to ignore when I discovered David had taken out a second mortgage on his house without telling Maria. He broke down in my office, crying like I'd never seen a grown man cry, begging me not to tell her, promising he'd get help. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because he was my brother in every way that mattered. I gave him an ultimatum that December. Get professional help for the gambling, or we dissolve the partnership. David swore he'd already made an appointment with a counselor, showed me a business card for a treatment center, even let me drive him to what he claimed was his first session. For 3 months, things seemed better. He arrived on time, focused during meetings, and our accounts stayed balanced. But David Martinez was a gifted liar, and I was a trusting fool. The next 72 hours unfolded like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. What started as a missing person case quickly morphed into something far more sinister when they found the body. Detective Walsh called me at home Monday morning, her voice carefully neutral. "Mr. Rivera, we need you to come down to the station. We've found David Martinez." The relief I felt lasted exactly 3 seconds, until she added, "I'm sorry to tell you this, but Mr. Martinez is deceased. We found his body in the desert early this morning." Jennifer drove me to the police station, her hand squeezing mine in the passenger seat. Neither of us spoke during the 20-minute drive. What was there to say? David was dead, and somehow I'd become the last person to see him alive, or, at least, the last person to see the crime scene. At the station, Detective Walsh sat across from me in a small interview room. Her case file spread between us like evidence of my guilt. The detective's case file with highlighted evidence would become my obsession during those early prison years. Every witness statement and timeline memorized until I could recite them in my sleep. The body was discovered by hikers about 30 miles south of Phoenix, Walsh explained. Preliminary examination suggests Mr. Martinez died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with the blood evidence we found at your warehouse. My warehouse. The possessive pronoun slipped out automatically, and I immediately regretted it. You and Mr. Martinez owned the warehouse jointly, correct? According to your partnership agreement, you both had equal access and responsibility for the property. She was right, but hearing it phrased that way made me sound like I was claiming sole ownership of the murder scene. Everything I said seemed to make things worse. "Mr. Rivera, we've been investigating Mr. Martinez's activities in the days before his death. We've spoken with several people who knew about the tensions in your business relationship. That's when she introduced me to Elena Rodriguez, though I wouldn't learn her name until later." Walsh described her as a concerned citizen who lived near the warehouse and had come forward with information. This witness observed you and Mr. Martinez arguing outside the warehouse on February 12th, 2 days before you reported finding the crime scene. She described the argument as heated and said she heard you threaten Mr. Martinez. My blood ran cold. February 12th was the day David and I had met to discuss the Morrison Group opportunity. We'd argued. Yes, I'd confronted him about some suspicious bank transactions, but threatening him, never. That's not what happened, I protested. Yes, we argued about business issues, but I never threatened David. This witness is mistaken. Mrs. Rodriguez was very specific about what she heard. She said you told Mr. Martinez, "If you don't stop, I'll make sure you never gamble again." The words were close enough to what I'd actually said to be believable, but twisted just enough to sound like a threat. I'd told David that if he didn't stop gambling with company money, I'd dissolve our partnership and make sure his wife knew about his addiction. But in the context of his murder, my words sounded like a death threat. Walsh continued building her case methodically. The financial motive was obvious. Our business was struggling, and David's gambling had put us both at risk. There was a life insurance policy on each partner worth $500,000, enough to pay off business debts and leave me financially stable. "Mr. Rivera, we've also discovered that you recently increased your business insurance coverage. The policy on Mr. Martinez's life doubled just 6 months ago." That was true, but it had been David's idea. He'd suggested we increase coverage to protect both families if something happened to either partner. At the time, it seemed like responsible business planning. Now, it looked like premeditation. The physical evidence seemed overwhelming. My fingerprints were on the murder weapon, that broken bottle I'd foolishly picked up. Security footage showed me at the warehouse around the time of death. David's blood was on my clothes from when I'd knelt beside the stains, trying to understand what had happened. We're also looking into your whereabouts on the evening of February 13th, Walsh said. Several witnesses place you in the area of where the body was found. That was impossible. February 13th was a Friday night, and I'd been home with Jennifer and the kids, watching movies and eating pizza. But when they checked with Jennifer, she remembered that I'd gone out around 9 o'clock to handle some business issues. I'd actually driven to a gas station to buy cigarettes, a stress-induced habit I'd recently picked up. But the receipt and security footage were long gone. My lawyer, Robert Kim, arrived just as Walsh was preparing to arrest me. Robert was a decent criminal defense attorney, but he specialized in DUI cases and white-collar crime, not murder. As he reviewed the evidence, I watched his confidence drain from his face like water from a broken glass. "Marcus, I have to be honest with you," Robert said during our first private consultation. "The evidence is very strong. The prosecution has physical evidence, witness testimony, clear motive, and opportunity. We need to seriously consider a plea bargain." "A plea bargain?" "Robert, I didn't kill David. I couldn't kill David. How can I plead guilty to something I didn't do? Because the alternative might be life in prison without parole. If we can negotiate a voluntary manslaughter charge, maybe we can get you 15 to 20 years instead of life." The media coverage began within hours of my arrest. Business Partners' deal turns deadly ran on the front page of the Arizona Republic. Local television stations picked up the story, painting me as a greedy businessman who killed his partner for insurance, money, and control of their company. The community reaction was swift and brutal. Clients canceled contracts. Suppliers demanded immediate payment of outstanding invoices. Former friends crossed the street to avoid Jennifer at the grocery store. Our children faced taunts at school from classmates who'd seen their father's mugshot on the evening news. Most painful of all was David's family's reaction. Maria Martinez, whom I'd known for over a decade, whom I'd watched grieve through her father's death and celebrate her daughter's birthdays, now looked at me with pure hatred. "You killed my husband," she sobbed during my arraignment, her voice carrying across the courtroom. "You killed the father of my children for money. How could you do this to us?" Her words cut deeper than any physical pain I'd ever experienced. The twins, Sophia and Carmen, clung to their mother as she spoke, their young faces confused and terrified. These children, who had played with my own kids, who called me Uncle Marcus, now feared me as their father's killer. As the investigation continued, more evidence emerged. Elena Rodriguez's testimony became more detailed and damaging. She now claimed she'd seen me loading something heavy into my truck on the night of February 13th. Phone records showed several calls between David and me in the days before his death. Calls I remembered as routine business discussions, but which prosecutors would characterize as increasingly hostile negotiations. The trap was perfect, and I was caught squarely in its center. Someone had orchestrated David's murder and my downfall with meticulous precision, but I was too overwhelmed by grief and shock to see the conspiracy taking shape around me. All I knew was that my best friend was dead, and everyone believed I'd killed him. February 14th, 2009. Valentine's Day was supposed to be romantic dinner with Jennifer at our favorite Italian restaurant. Instead, it became the day my entire world collapsed, though I wouldn't understand that for months. I was reviewing invoices at home around 3 in the afternoon when my phone rang. David's name appeared on the caller ID, and something in his voice immediately set me on edge. "Marcus, thank God you picked up. I need you to meet me at the warehouse right now. We've got a situation." "What kind of situation?" "I thought you were taking Maria out for Valentine's, that big commercial project we've been chasing. The Morrison Group. They want to meet tonight. I know it's last minute, but this could be huge for us. $2 million contract. Marcus, we can't pass this up." The Morrison Group had been our white whale for 6 months, a development company that specialized in high-end shopping centers. Landing them as a client would set us up for years. Still, something felt off about the urgency. Why tonight? And why at the warehouse instead of their office? The project manager is flying back to Chicago tomorrow morning. It's now or never. He specifically asked to see our equipment and storage facility. You know how these corporate types are, they want to kick the tires before they sign anything. I glanced at the clock. Jennifer wouldn't be home from her salon appointments until 6, giving me time to handle this meeting and still make our dinner reservation. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The drive to our warehouse took 20 minutes through Saturday afternoon traffic. Located in an industrial district south of Phoenix, the 10,000 square foot building housed our equipment, materials, and served as our unofficial office for larger projects. We'd been leasing it for 3 years, and David had been spending more time there lately, claiming he needed space to focus on paperwork without distractions. I pulled into the empty parking lot around 4:30, noting that David's truck wasn't there yet. The warehouse sat alone on its block, surrounded by similar buildings that were mostly vacant on weekends. As I approached the entrance, I noticed the side door was slightly ajar unusual, since we always kept it locked. "David," I called out. As I stepped inside, "You here already?" Silence greeted me, along with something that made my stomach clench. The warehouse felt wrong. Our normally organized space looked like a tornado had torn through it. Wooden pallets were scattered across the floor. Some of our power tools lay smashed near the loading dock, and there were dark stains on the concrete that I didn't want to identify. "David," I shouted louder, my voice echoing off the metal walls. "What the hell happened here?" That's when I saw a broken beer bottle near the overturned desk, its jagged edge stained with what was unmistakably blood. Without thinking, I rushed over and picked it up, trying to understand what had happened. The blood was still tacky, not completely dry. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to call 911, but then I stopped. Where was David? Had someone hurt him? Kidnapped him? My mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. I searched every corner of the warehouse, calling his name, checking storage rooms and the small office space we'd built in the back. Nothing. No sign of David. No note. No explanation for the destruction or the blood. Finally, with my fingerprints now all over the broken bottle and probably contaminating any other evidence, I dialed 911, double quotes, 911, "What's your emergency?" "This is Marcus Rivera. I think something terrible has happened to my business partner. I'm at our warehouse, and there's been some kind of struggle. There's blood, and David is missing." The operator kept me on the line while dispatching units, asking me to describe exactly what I'd found and what I'd touched. Every answer I gave seemed to make things worse. Yes, I'd entered the building alone. Yes, I'd touched potential evidence. No, I didn't know where David was or who might want to hurt him. Detective Sarah Walsh arrived within 15 minutes, followed by crime scene technicians and more police cars than seemed necessary for a missing person case. Walsh was a veteran, detective in her 40s, with graying blonde hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. "Mr. Rivera, I'm Detective Walsh. Can you walk me through exactly what happened when you arrived?" I explained about David's call, the urgent meeting with the Morrison Group, finding the door open and the warehouse destroyed. Walsh took notes while crime scene photographers documented everything, including the broken bottle I'd foolishly picked up. "This Morrison Group meeting," Walsh said. "Did you speak with them directly?" "No. David handled all the initial contact. He said they specifically requested this location. We'll need to verify that. Do you have contact information for this company?" I realized I didn't. David had been managing that relationship exclusively, claiming he had an inside connection from his college days. Another red flag I'd missed while we talked. A technician approached with a handheld device. "Detective, We're getting positive presumptive tests for blood in multiple locations. Victim lost a significant amount based on spatter patterns. Victim. The word hit me like a physical blow. David wasn't just missing, someone had hurt him badly enough to leave blood evidence throughout our warehouse. Mr. Rivera, Detective Walsh, continued, I need to ask some difficult questions. Were you and Mr. Martinez having any business disputes, financial problems, personal conflicts? I thought about David's gambling, the missing money, the tension between us over the past few months. How could I explain that without making myself look guilty? We'd been having some issues, I admitted. David has a gambling problem, and there were some irregularities in our accounts. But I would never hurt him. He's like a brother to me. Even as I said it, I could see how it sounded. Business partner with financial motives, found at crime scene with victim's blood on his hands. The setup was perfect, and I'd walked right into it. The warehouse security camera footage would later show me entering the building alone, but the timestamp discrepancies that proved the evidence had been manipulated wouldn't be discovered for 15 years. 6 months after David's death, I found myself sitting at the defendant's table in Maricopa County Superior Court, watching 12 strangers decide whether I would spend the rest of my life in prison. The media circus surrounding the trial had turned our tragedy into entertainment, with reporters camping outside the courthouse and cable news shows debating my guilt during their evening broadcasts. Prosecutor James Mitchell was everything Robert Kim wasn't: experienced, charismatic, and absolutely convinced of my guilt. A 20-year veteran of the district attorney's office with an impressive conviction rate, Mitchell had built his reputation on complex murder cases. During jury selection, he'd made it clear that this trial wasn't just about David's death, it was about justice for a family destroyed by greed. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Mitchell began his opening statement. This case is about betrayal in its most heinous form. Marcus Rivera didn't just murder his business partner, he murdered his best friend, his children's godfather, a man who trusted him completely. And he did it for the oldest motive in the world: money. Mitchell's presentation was masterful. He walked the jury through our friendship, emphasizing how David had trusted me with his life and livelihood. He detailed David's gambling problems, painting them not as an addiction, but as a minor flaw that I'd exploited for my own gain. The defendant wants you to believe that David Martinez's gambling was out of control, that their business was in serious trouble. But the evidence will show that their company was profitable, that David's gambling was manageable, and that the only person who stood to benefit from David's death was the man sitting right there, Marcus Rivera. The physical evidence came first. Crime scene photos of the warehouse, blood spatter analysis, the broken bottle with my fingerprints. Each piece seemed more damning than the last. The forensic expert testified that the blood patterns were consistent with a violent struggle, and that David had likely been struck multiple times before the fatal blow. Elena Rodriguez took the stand on the third day, and her testimony was devastating. She appeared to be exactly what she claimed a concerned neighbor who'd witnessed something terrible and felt compelled to come forward. I was watering my garden around 6 o'clock when I heard shouting from the warehouse next door. Elena testified, her voice soft but clear. I looked over and saw 2 men arguing by the loading dock. I recognized Mr. Rivera because I'd seen him there many times before. Can you tell us what you heard during this argument? Mitchell asked. Mr. Rivera was very angry. He was pointing his finger at the other man, Mr. Martinez, and I heard him say, "If you don't stop, I'll make sure you never gamble again." Then he said something about how he was tired of David ruining everything for both of them. Did you see what happened next? Mr. Rivera grabbed Mr. Martinez by the shirt and shook him. Mr. Martinez tried to walk away, but Mr. Rivera followed him into the warehouse. That's when I went inside and called my daughter. I was frightened. Elena's testimony was believable because it contained just enough truth to be credible. David and I had argued that day, and our conversation had been heated. But her version twisted my words and actions into something sinister. something that perfectly supported the prosecution's theory of premeditated murder. Robert Kim tried his best during cross-examination, but Alina was well prepared. She stuck to her story, appearing confused and hurt when Robert suggested she might be mistaken about what she'd seen. "Ma'am, isn't it possible that what you interpreted as a threat was actually Mr. Rivera trying to help his partner with a gambling addiction?" "I know what I heard," Alina replied firmly. "Mr. Rivera was angry, and he was threatening Mr. Martinez. I'll never forget the look in his eyes." The financial evidence was equally damaging. The prosecution's forensic accountant testified that our business was actually more stable than I'd claimed, that David's gambling losses were significant but not catastrophic. The insurance policy I'd increased looked like a smoking gun, especially when Mitchell suggested I'd been planning David's murder for months. Mr. Rivera increased his partner's life insurance policy from $250,000 to $500,000 just 6 months before the murder. The accountant explained, "This change came during a period when the business was actually performing well, making the timing highly suspicious." When they called Maria Martinez to testify, I thought my heart might stop beating. David's widow had lost at least 20 pounds since his death, and her eyes held a emptiness that haunted me. She spoke about their marriage, their plans for the future, the impact David's death had on their daughters. "David loved Marcus like a brother," Maria said, tears streaming down her face. "He trusted him completely. He used to say that Marcus was the most honest man he knew, that he could always count on him. That's what makes this so horrible. David died, believing his best friend was coming to help him." The prosecution's case seemed airtight, but Robert Kim had prepared a defense based on reasonable doubt. He argued that the investigation had been rushed, that police had focused on me too quickly and missed other potential suspects. He highlighted David's gambling debts, suggesting that dangerous people might have killed him for money he owed. "Ladies and gentlemen, David Martinez owed gambling debts to some very dangerous people," Robert told the jury during his opening statement. "The prosecution wants you to believe that Marcus Rivera, a successful businessman with no history of violence, suddenly decided to murder his best friend for insurance money. But what if the truth is simpler? What if David Martinez was killed by the kind of people who break legs when debts aren't paid on time?" It was a reasonable theory, but Robert couldn't prove it. We had no evidence of specific threats against David, no names of bookies or loan sharks, no paper trail leading to organized crime. Meanwhile, the prosecution had physical evidence, witness testimony, and a clear motive. When I took the stand in my own defense, I tried to tell the truth about my friendship with David, about the business problems we'd faced, about finding the crime scene and trying to help. But under Mitchell's cross-examination, every answer seemed to make me look guiltier. "Mr. Rivera, you've testified that you loved David Martinez like a brother. Is that correct?" "Yes, absolutely." "Yet you were prepared to dissolve your business partnership and destroy his family's financial security because of his gambling." "I was trying to help him. I thought tough love might force him to get treatment, by threatening to tell his wife about his addiction, by threatening to take away his livelihood. It wasn't a threat, it was an intervention. An intervention that would have left Mr. Martinez bankrupt and humiliated. Every question was a trap. Mitchell made my attempts to help David sound like calculated cruelty. My concern for our business looked like greed. My presence at the crime scene seemed like a return to cover up my crime." The court stenographer's transcript of closing arguments would later become evidence of how effectively Mitchell had painted me as a cold-blooded killer. His final statement to the jury was a masterpiece of persuasion. "Marcus Rivera wants you to believe he's the victim here, that he's been wrongly accused of murdering his best friend. But the evidence tells a different story. The evidence shows us a man who was tired of his partner's problems, who saw an opportunity to solve his financial troubles permanently, and who calculated that $500,000 in insurance money was worth more than David Martinez's life. Mitchell walked the jury through the timeline again, connecting each piece of evidence to support his theory. My fingerprints on the murder weapon, Alina Rodriguez's eyewitness testimony, the increased insurance policy, my presence at the warehouse, the disposal of David's body in the desert. David Martinez trusted Marcus Rivera completely, and that trust killed him. Don't let the defendant's lies and excuses prevent justice for David, for Maria, for Sophia, and Carmen. Find Marcus Rivera guilty of first-degree murder. Robert's closing argument was passionate, but futile. He asked the jury to consider reasonable doubt, to question whether the investigation had been thorough enough, to imagine alternative scenarios. But I could see in the jurors' faces that they'd already made up their minds. The jury deliberated for 4 hours, barely enough time to elect a foreman and review the evidence. When they returned to the courtroom, I searched their faces for any sign of uncertainty or compassion. I found none. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor, on the charge of murder in the first degree. How do you find we find the defendant, Marcus Rivera, guilty? The words hit me like a physical blow. Jennifer's sob echoed through the courtroom. Maria Martinez nodded grimly, finally having the justice she'd demanded. My children, too young to understand the proceedings, but old enough to sense disaster, clung to their mother. During sentencing 3 weeks later, Judge Patricia Holbrook gave me the opportunity to address the court. I stood on shaking legs, looking at Maria and the twins, at my own family, at the reporters who would broadcast my words across the state. I didn't kill David Martinez, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He was my best friend, and I loved him. I don't know who murdered him, but it wasn't me. I'll spend every day for the rest of my life trying to prove my innocence and find his real killer. Judge Holbrook sentenced me to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. As the bailiff placed handcuffs on my wrists, I took one last look at Jennifer and my children, not knowing that it would be months before I saw them again, and years before Ashley and Michael would be willing to speak to me. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and cameras as they led me away. Maria Martinez stood with her daughters, finally able to tell the world that justice had been served. But as I was loaded into the transport van, I caught sight of a woman in the crowd who looked familiar, Alina Rodriguez, the witness whose testimony had sealed my fate. She was talking quietly on a cell phone, her expression not one of relief or satisfaction, but of worry. That image would haunt me for years. The first hint that there was more to David's murder than anyone had discovered. Millbrook Correctional Facility sits like a concrete cancer in the Arizona desert, 30 miles from anything resembling civilization. The first time I saw those razor wire-topped walls and guard towers, I understood that my old life was truly over. The prison intake medical report documented my physical condition upon arrival: blood pressure dangerously elevated, severe anxiety, and what the staff psychologist noted as acute adjustment disorder with depressive features and suicidal ideation. I wanted to die during those first weeks, not from any grand gesture of protest or despair, but from a bone-deep exhaustion that made breathing feel like too much effort. The constant noisemen shouting, metal doors slamming, televisions blaring created a sensory assault that left me hollow and shaking. I'd gone from a quiet suburban home, where my biggest worry was Ashley's soccer schedule, to a place where survival required constant vigilance. My first cellmate was Tony Rodriguez, a lifer who'd been locked up for 18 years on an armed robbery conviction. Tony was in his 50s, with graying hair and intelligent brown eyes that had seen too much. He took one look at me during my first night, curled in the corner of my bunk, still wearing the county jail jumpsuit that smelled like disinfectant, and Firan shook his head. "First time inside?" he asked. Though my terror was obviously answer enough, I nodded, not trusting my voice. "What did they get you for?" "Murder," I whispered, "but I didn't do it." Tony laughed, but not unkindly. "Brother, that's what we all say the first year. Innocent Man's Club meets every day in the yard. Biggest membership of any group in here. I really didn't kill him. David was my best friend. Something in my voice must have convinced Tony that my protest was different from the usual denials. He sat on the edge of his bunk and studied me for a long moment. "You know what the worst part about being innocent inside is?" he finally said. "It's not the guards who don't believe you, or the other inmates who think you're lying. It's holding on to that innocence when everything about this place is designed to make you guilty of something." Tony became my unlikely mentor in the brutal education of prison survival. He taught me which guards could be trusted and which ones would write you up for breathing wrong. He explained the unwritten rules that governed every aspect of daily life, where to sit in the mess hall, how to walk through the yard without appearing threatening or weak, which inmates to avoid completely. "The key to surviving in here is becoming invisible," Tony explained during one of our late-night conversations. "Don't stand out. Don't cause trouble. Don't get involved in other people's business. Keep your head down and do your time." But keeping my head down felt like giving up on David, on my family, on the truth. Every day that passed was another day his real killer walked free, while I rotted in a cage. The rage that consumed me during those early months was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, a white-hot fury that made my hands shake and my vision blur. I wrote letters constantly. To Jennifer, begging her to believe in my innocence. To Robert Kim, demanding he continue investigating. To journalists, hoping someone would examine the case more closely. To David's family, trying to explain that I was grieving too, that losing him had destroyed my life in ways they couldn't imagine. Most of those letters were never sent. Prison staff read all outgoing mail, and I learned quickly that anything that sounded like I was continuing to proclaim my innocence or criticize the investigation would be confiscated. The few letters that did make it out often went unanswered. Jennifer's visits became my lifeline during those first months. She would drive the 3 hours from Phoenix every other Sunday, bringing Ashley and Michael to see their father through thick glass, speaking through phones that made our voices sound tinny and distant. The visits were agony and salvation at the same time, precious contact with the family I'd lost, but also stark reminders of how much my incarceration was hurting them. Ashley, who had been 8 when I was arrested, struggled to understand why Daddy lived in this scary place. She would press her small hand against the glass partition, trying to touch mine, asking when I was coming home. Michael, only 6, was frightened by the guards and the other inmates he glimpsed during the visit process. He would cry during most of our phone conversations, begging me to come home. "The kids are asking questions I don't know how to answer," Jennifer told me during one particularly difficult visit. "Ashley's teacher says she's been acting out at school, getting into fights with other children. Michael won't sleep in his own bed anymore." The guilt was overwhelming. Not only had I been unable to protect David, but my conviction was destroying my children's sense of security and normalcy. They were paying the price for crimes they didn't understand, committed by someone else entirely. Tony helped me process these emotions during our long conversations after lights out. He'd been inside since his son was a toddler and had watched his own family disintegrate from a distance. "The hardest part isn't what prison does to you," Tony told me one night. "It's what it does to the people you love. Your family is doing time too, Marcus. Just on the outside." He was right. Jennifer aged years in those first months. Dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights and stress. She'd lost weight and developed a nervous habit of twisting her wedding ring. The woman who used to laugh at my terrible jokes and dance with me in our kitchen now looked at me with a mixture of love and desperate sadness that broke my heart. But it was Tony's own story that truly opened my eyes to the reality of my situation. He'd been convicted of armed robbery based on a victim's identification, despite having an alibi and no criminal history. Like me, he'd maintained his innocence for years, filing appeals and writing letters, convinced that the truth would eventually surface. "I spent my first 5 years inside fighting the system," Tony told me. Writing appeals, demanding investigations, burning through what little money my family had on lawyers who promised miracles. You know what I learned? The system doesn't care about the truth once you're convicted. It cares about finality, about closing cases, and moving on. So you just gave up. Accepted being innocent and locked up. I accepted that my energy was better spent surviving than fighting windmills. I got my GED in here, then a bachelor's degree through correspondence courses. I help other inmates learn to read. I have found ways to make my life meaningful, even in this place. The prison GED program became my own salvation. Teaching literacy to other inmates gave me a sense of purpose that the endless appeals and legal letters couldn't provide. Many of the men in my tutoring group had been failed by the education system long before they'd been failed by the justice system. Helping them read their first complete sentences or solve basic math problems reminded me that there was still good I could do, even from inside these walls. My first Christmas in prison nearly broke me completely. The visiting room was decorated with sad tinsel and paper snowflakes that someone had tried to make festive. Jennifer brought the kids for what would be our last family visit for several months. Ashley had lost 2 front teeth and looked impossibly older. Michael clung to his mother throughout the entire visit, refusing to come close to the glass partition. "Daddy, are you coming home for New Year's?" Ashley asked, her lisp making the words almost unintelligible through the phone. I looked at Jennifer, who was fighting back tears. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that Daddy might never come home? That the justice system had decided he was a bad man who belonged in a cage? "I'm going to try, sweetheart. Daddy's going to try very hard." It was a lie, and we all knew it. But sometimes lies are the only mercy we can offer the people we love. After they left that day, I returned to my cell and found Tony reading a letter from his own son, now a grown man with children of his own, who barely knew their grandfather existed. Tony's acceptance of his situation no longer seemed like wisdom. It seemed like surrender. That night, I made a decision that would shape the rest of my incarceration. I would never stop fighting to prove my innocence, but I would also never stop living whatever life was possible within these walls. David deserved justice, but my children deserved a father who didn't give up on the world entirely. I had no idea that 15 years later, that decision would save my sanity when the impossible finally happened. 3 years into my sentence, the phone calls from home became increasingly rare, and Jennifer's visits dropped to once a month, then every 6 weeks. I could see the toll my incarceration was taking on her, not just emotionally, but practically. She was trying to raise 2 young children, alone, while dealing with the stigma of being a convicted murderer's wife. The community that had once embraced our family now treated them like pariahs. Jennifer lost clients at the salon where she worked part-time. Ashley and Michael faced constant whispers and cruel comments at school. Other parents didn't want their children playing with the kids whose father was a killer. Birthday party invitations stopped coming. Playdates became non-existent. "I can't do this anymore, Marcus," Jennifer told me during what I didn't know would be our last visit as a married couple. She looked exhausted, her once bright eyes now dull with stress and resignation. "The kids are suffering, and I'm barely keeping us afloat financially. I know it's hard, baby, but we can get through this. My appeals, your appeals, have been going on for 3 years. 3 years, Marcus. Ashley is 11 now, and she started asking me if you really killed Mr. Martinez. How am I supposed to answer that?" The question hit me like a physical blow. My own daughter was beginning to doubt my innocence. The lawyers, the media, the community, they'd all convinced themselves of my guilt. But Ashley, she was supposed to be different. She was supposed to know her father. You tell her the truth. You tell her that her daddy would never hurt anyone, especially not Uncle David. Jennifer looked away, unable to meet my eyes through the glass partition. She asked me why you were in prison, if you didn't do anything wrong. She's old enough now to understand that innocent people don't usually get convicted of murder. Innocent people get convicted all the time. That's exactly what happened to me. Is it, Marcus? Because sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep, I wonder if there's something I don't know. Some part of the story you haven't told me. Her words cut deeper than any prison beating ever could. My own wife, the woman who had promised to love me through better and worse, was beginning to question my innocence. If I couldn't convince Jennifer, how could I ever hope to prove the truth to the world? The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by a guard who handed them to me with the same indifference he'd show delivering a magazine subscription renewal. Jennifer's petition cited irretrievable breakdown of the marriage and requested sole custody of both children. She was also asking the court to allow her to resume using her maiden name Jennifer Walsher, easing even the connection our marriage had created. I read the documents 3 times before the reality sunk in. Jennifer wasn't just leaving me, she was systematically removing every trace of our life together. She wanted to move the children to her sister's house in Tucson, nearly 4 hours away from the prison. She wanted to change Ashley and Michael's last names from Rivera back to Walsh. She wanted to make it as if our family had never existed. The worst part was that I understood why she was doing it. Staying married to me meant condemning herself and our children to a lifetime of whispers and suspicion. It meant Ashley and Michael growing up as the murderer's kids, carrying that stigma through high school, college, and beyond. Jennifer was trying to save them, the only way she knew how, by cutting all ties to their convicted father. Tony found me in our cell that evening, staring at the divorce papers spread across my small desk. I hadn't moved in hours. "Family problems?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. "She's leaving me, taking the kids and changing their names. By Christmas, I won't legally be their father anymore." Tony sat on his bunk and lit a cigarette contraband. But the guards rarely bothered with small infractions in our cell block. "How long you been married?" 14 years. Met her in college. Married her right after graduation. She was everything I wanted in a partner: smart, funny, beautiful. She used to laugh at my stupid jokes and steal French fries off my plate. "She'll ever visit you before?" This every month for 3 years. But I could see it getting harder for her each time. The drive, the security procedures, talking through those damn phones. And the kids, they're scared of this place. Michael won't even look at me anymore during visits. Tony took a long drag of his cigarette and exhaled slowly. "My wife left me after 2 years inside, took my boy and moved back to her mother's place in California. I haven't seen either of them in 16 years. Do you blame her?" "Used to. Spent years hating her for abandoning me when I needed her most. But then I realized she didn't abandon me, abandoned them the day I got arrested. Doesn't matter that I was innocent. Doesn't matter that I was trying to provide for my family. The result was the same. I left them to deal with the consequences of my choices. But I didn't make any choices. I was framed. Maybe so, but your family is still paying the price. Your wife is still trying to raise 2 kids alone, while everyone in town thinks she married a killer. Your children are still getting bullied at school because of your conviction. From their perspective, it doesn't matter why you're inherently, that you are." The phone call to discuss the divorce was one of the hardest conversations of my life. Jennifer sounded tired and distant, like she was talking to a stranger rather than the man she'd shared a bed with for over a decade. "I need you to sign the papers, Marcus. I need to move on with my life. What about Ashley and Michael? They need their father. They need stability. They need to go to school without being afraid that someone will call their daddy a murderer. They need a chance at a normal life. I am their father. Being in prison doesn't change that. Being convicted of murder changes everything. I've met someone, Marcus. Tom Wilson. He owns the auto repair shop on Camelback Road. He's good with the kids, and he wants to help me give them a stable home. Tom Wilson, David's friend from high school. Someone who'd been at our barbecues and birthday parties. Someone who'd known our family when we were happy and whole. The irony was devastating. My children would be raised by a man who had probably believed from day one that I was guilty of murdering David. Does he know I'm innocent? He knows you're in prison for murder. That's enough. The custody hearing took place without me. Convicted felons don't get leave to attend civil proceedings. My court-appointed attorney told me it was a formality anyway. Judges rarely granted custody rights to incarcerated parents, especially those convicted of violent crimes. Jennifer was awarded sole custody, permission to relocate to Tucson, and the right to change the children's surnames. I was granted 2 phone calls per month and 1 visit every 3 months, assuming the children wanted to see me and Jennifer was willing to make the drive. The first phone call, under our new arrangement, was scheduled for Christmas Eve. I waited by the phone in the common area for 2 hours, watching other inmates talk to their families, listening to children's voices, asking when Daddy was coming home. When my scheduled time came and went without a call, I asked the guard to check if there had been a mistake. No mistake, Rivera. Nobody called. I found out later that Ashley and Michael had spent Christmas Eve at Tom's family gathering, opening presents and eating dinner with people who would never remind them that their biological father was serving life for murder. Jennifer had decided that maintaining contact with me would only confuse the children and make their adjustment to their new life more difficult. My mother Helen continued to visit me every week, the one constant in my rapidly shrinking world. She never wavered in her belief in my innocence, never suggested that maybe I should just accept my fate and move on. During one particularly dark period, she brought photo albums from home, spreading pictures of Ashley and Michael across the visiting room table. "Look at their faces when they're with you," she said, pointing to a photo from Michael's 6th birthday party. "Look at how happy they are. That's real, Marcus. That love doesn't just disappear because a judge says you're guilty." But as months passed without any contact from my children, I began to wonder if love was enough. Ashley and Michael were building new lives with new routines and new father figures. Every day that passed made me more of a stranger to them, more of an abstract concept than a real person. The final blow came in a letter from Jennifer's lawyer, informing me that Tom Wilson wanted to legally adopt Ashley and Michael. If I agreed to terminate my parental rights voluntarily, they would be spared the trauma of a contested adoption proceeding. If I refused, they would file motions arguing that my continued contact with the children was detrimental to their emotional well-being. I stared at that letter for hours, understanding that this was my final choice as their father. I could fight to maintain my legal rights and force my children to navigate a court battle that would expose them to more publicity and trauma. Or I could sign away my claim to them and let them become Tom Wilson's children completely. Tony found me burning the letter in our cell's small metal trash can. "Probably not the smartest thing to do," he observed. "Doesn't matter. They want me to disappear completely. Maybe that's the most loving thing I can do for Ashley and Michael. Give them permission to forget their murderer father ever existed." "You really believe that?" "I don't know what I believe anymore. Maybe Jennifer's right. Maybe they're better off without me." The next morning, I called Jennifer and told her I would sign the adoption papers. She cried when I told her, which surprised me. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I know this isn't what you wanted. I want them to be happy. If that means pretending I never existed, then that's what we'll do." But as I hung up the phone, I made myself a promise. Someday, when Ashley and Michael were adults and could make their own decisions about whether to know me, I would find a way to tell them the truth about what happened to David Martinez. I would prove my innocence, not just for my own sake, but so my children would know that their biological father wasn't the monster everyone believed him to be. I had no idea that someday was still more than a decade away. Years 5 through 12 of my incarceration blurred together like a long gray dream, punctuated by small victories and devastating setbacks. My prison journal from this period reads, "Like the emotional roadmap of a man learning to survive without hope while refusing to surrender completely. The handwritten pages, filled with observations about daily life, legal strategies, and letters I would never send, became my lifeline to sanity. The prison library became my sanctuary during those middle years. As one of the few inmates with a college degree, I was eventually offered a job there that paid 18 cents an hour, but provided something more valuable than money: access to law books and a quiet space where I could work on my appeals without interruption. I read every criminal law textbook I could find, studying precedents for overturned convictions and investigating flaws in forensic evidence. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, was a retired teacher who treated all of us with dignity, regardless of our crimes. She helped me request specific legal texts through the interlibrary loan system and never questioned why a convicted murderer was spending 8 hours a day reading about DNA analysis and witness reliability. Education is the one thing they can't take away from you in here, she told me during one of our conversations. Whatever happens with your case, you'll leave this place knowing more about law than most lawyers. She was right. I became an expert on wrongful convictions, memorizing the details of cases where innocent people had been exonerated after decades in prison. The Innocence Project became my Bible, and I wrote them letters every few months describing my case and begging for help. They always responded politely, explaining that they received thousands of similar requests and could only take on cases with clear DNA evidence or other compelling proof of innocence. My appeals continued to be denied with frustrating regularity. Robert Kim had given up after the second rejection, telling me frankly that he'd exhausted all reasonable legal options. The appellate courts found no errors in my trial, no misconduct by prosecutors, no new evidence significant enough to warrant overturning my conviction. But I refused to give up. I began representing myself in subsequent appeals, filing handwritten briefs that probably read like the desperate pleas of a guilty man trying to escape justice. The few lawyers who reviewed my work pro bono told me I was wasting my time, that the evidence against me was too strong, and the conviction too solid to challenge. During year 7, I struck up a correspondence with Sarah Chen, a paralegal from Portland who wrote to inmates as part of a pen pal program. Sarah was intelligent and kind, and our letters provided an emotional connection to the outside world that I desperately needed. For 6 months, we wrote twice a week, sharing our thoughts about books, movies, and life in general. Sarah never asked about my crime initially, accepting my innocence claims without judgment. When she finally did visit, driving all the way from Oregon to meet me in person, I thought maybe I'd found someone who could love me, despite my circumstances. I've been thinking about this for weeks, Sarah told me during our second visit, about what it would mean to have a relationship with someone in your situation. My heart soared. After years of isolation and rejection, the possibility of love seemed like a miracle. I care about you, Marcus, but I can't build my life around visiting a prison. I can't plan a future with someone who might never get out. I'm sorry. The end of our correspondence left me more isolated than before. Sarah had offered a glimpse of what connection felt like, and losing it reminded me of everything prison had taken away, not just freedom, but the possibility of love, companionship, and normal human relationships. My mother Helen remained my only consistent visitor throughout these years, driving 3 hours each way every Sunday, regardless of weather or her own health problems. She was in her 70s now, diabetic, and dealing with heart issues that made the long drive increasingly difficult. Maybe you should skip some visits, Mom. Save your energy. Nonsense. You're my son, and I'm not abandoning you no matter what those idiots in court decided. Helen brought me news from the outside world, updates on Ashley and Michael that she gathered from mutual friends, and occasional encounters at the grocery store. My children were thriving in their new life. Ashley was an honor student and star soccer player, while Michael excelled at mathematics and played Little League baseball. They called Tom Wilson Dad now, and rarely mentioned their biological father. They look happy, Helen would tell me, showing snapshots she'd taken discreetly at Michael's baseball games. Ashley's got your stubborn streak, and Michael has your smile. These updates were simultaneously heartbreaking and comforting. I was glad my children were succeeding, but each achievement felt like another step away from any possible reconciliation. They were building lives that didn't include me, creating memories and milestones that I would never share. The teaching program became my salvation during these dark years. Helping other inmates earn their GEDs gave me a sense of purpose that the endless legal research couldn't provide. Many of my students had been failed by the education system long before they'd been failed by the justice system. There was Miguel, the gang member serving time for assault who could barely read when we started working together. Teaching him to sound out words and eventually read complete sentences felt like a genuine victory. When he passed his GED exam after 2 years of study, he cried in front of the whole classroom. Nobody ever believed I was smart enough for school, Miguel told me. You helped me prove them wrong. James was a drug dealer from South Phoenix who had an incredible aptitude for mathematics but had never learned basic algebra. Watching him solve complex equations for the first time reminded me that intelligence exists everywhere, even in places society prefers to ignore. I could have been an engineer, James said during one of our tutoring sessions, if I'd stayed in school instead of dropping out to help support my family. These men became my extended family, and their successes provided meaning that my own legal battles couldn't deliver. When Miguel was released and sent me a photo of himself in a construction worker's uniform, when James completed his bachelor's degree through correspondence courses, when dozens of other students passed exams they'd never thought possible, these victories sustained me through the darkest periods. But the violence of prison life was always present, a constant reminder that I was living in a world governed by different rules. I witnessed stabbings in the yard, riots that left men permanently disabled, guards who used excessive force against inmates who couldn't fight back. The brutality became normalized, just another aspect of daily existence that had to be endured rather than challenged. During year 9, a new inmate named Carlos Mendez was assigned to our cell block. Carlos had been convicted of murdering his wife's lover, and his rage over the conviction consumed him completely. He spent his days planning elaborate revenge schemes against the judge, prosecutors, and witnesses who had testified against him. They destroyed my life, Carlos would rant during meals. I'm going to destroy theirs when I get out. You're never getting out, I told him bluntly. Life without parole means exactly that. You're here until you die. Then I'll find another way. My cousin knows people. Money talks, even from inside. Carlos's obsession with revenge reminded me of my own darker moments, times when I'd fantasized about confronting Elena Rodriguez or finding the real killer myself. But watching his anger consume him completely showed me how destructive those thoughts could become. You want to know the difference between you and me? I asked Carlos during one of his tirades. You're guilty. You actually did kill someone, and you're angry that you got caught. I'm innocent, and I'm angry that the real killer is still free. But anger without purpose is just poison. The distinction mattered to me, even if it didn't matter to anyone else. Maintaining my innocence wasn't just about legal appeals or eventual exoneration. It was about preserving some essential part of myself that prison couldn't destroy. Christmas became the hardest time each year, an annual reminder of the family celebrations I was missing. Other inmates received visits from children and grandchildren, care packages filled with homemade cookies and hand-drawn cards. My holidays were spent alone in the cell, reading letters from my mother and trying not to think about Ashley and Michael opening presents under Tom Wilson's Christmas tree. During year 11, I learned that Jennifer had given birth to twin daughters with Tom, Ashley, and Michael. Now had half-sisters who would grow up never knowing that their older siblings had a different biological father. The news hit me harder than I'd expected. Not jealousy over Jennifer's new life, but grief over the realization that my children now had a complete family that I wasn't part of. "You okay?" Tony asked, finding me staring at Helen's letter with the birth announcement. Jennifer had twins, girls. Ashley and Michael have little sisters now. That's good, right? More family for your kids? It means they don't need me anymore. They have a complete family, mother, father, siblings. I'm just a complication from their past. Maybe, or maybe someday they'll want to know where they came from. Blood doesn't lie, Marcus. Those kids carry your DNA, your family history. Eventually, they might want to understand that part of themselves. Tony's words offered a small comfort, but it was hard to maintain hope when the years kept passing without any contact from Ashley and Michael. They were teenagers now, old enough to reach out if they wanted to know me, old enough to understand that I maintained my innocence. Their silence felt like a verdict more final than any court judgment. The journal entries from year 12 show my emotional state most clearly. Page after page of questions without answers, plans that led nowhere, and a growing understanding that I might die in prison regardless of my innocence. But scattered throughout the despair were also moments of grace, successful students, meaningful friendships, small acts of kindness that reminded me humanity existed even in the darkest places. If I never get out, I wrote in one entry, I want my life in here to have meant something. I want the men I've taught to remember that education matters, that intelligence and worth aren't determined by the mistakes we've made. I want to prove that innocence isn't just about legal guilt, it's about refusing to let this place destroy the best parts of who you are. I had no idea that within 3 years, everything would change completely. Helen Rivera's health had been declining for months, but she'd hidden the worst of it from me during her visits. Looking back at our conversations from year 12, I can see the signs. I missed how she tired more easily during our talks, how she sometimes forgot details we'd discussed the week before, how her once steady handwriting had become shaky and uncertain. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in February, exactly 13 years after David's murder. I was in the library, helping a new student work through basic fractions, when a guard appeared at my table. "Rivera, you've got a call. Family emergency." The words hit me like ice water. Helen was my only family contact, the only person who would trigger an emergency call protocol. I followed the guard to the administrative office, my stomach churning with dread. "Marcus." The voice belonged to my Aunt Carmen, Helen's younger sister, whom I hadn't spoken to since my conviction. "Mijo, I'm so sorry. Your mother, is she? She's in the hospital. Diabetic coma. The doctors don't think she has much time left." The world seemed to tilt around me. Helen had been my anchor for 13 years, the one person who never wavered in her belief in my innocence, who made the 3-hour drive every Sunday, regardless of weather or her own failing health. The possibility of losing her felt like losing my last connection to the world outside these walls. I need to see her. There has to be a way for me to visit her in the hospital. Carmen's silence told me everything I needed to know. Compassionate leave for inmates was rare, and usually limited to immediate family members who were dying. Even then, it required approval from multiple levels of prison administration, and was often denied for security reasons. "I'll try to get permission," I told Carmen. "But if I can't, if she please, tell her I love her. Tell her I'm still fighting to prove my innocence. She knows, mijo. She never stopped believing in you." The next 48 hours were the longest of my incarceration. I filed emergency requests for compassionate leave, called in favors with guards who'd seen my mother visit faithfully for over a decade, and even offered to pay for my own transportation and security escort. Every request was denied. The official reason was security protocol. But I knew the real reason: convicted murderers don't get to say goodbye to their dying mothers. Helen Rivera passed away on Thursday evening while I sat in my cell, 300 miles away, reading Helen Rivera's final letter for the 100th time. She'd written it weeks before her final hospitalization and asked Carmen to give it to me only after her death. My dearest Marcus. The letter began in her familiar, careful handwriting. If you're reading this, then I've gone to be with your Father and the angels. I want you to know that leaving you behind is the hardest thing I've ever had to do, but I'm not really leaving. I'll be watching over you, praying for your freedom, and waiting for the day when the truth finally comes. Too light. The letter continued for 3 pages, filled with memories of my childhood. Expressions of pride in the man I'd become, despite my circumstances, and absolute certainty in my innocence. But it was the final paragraph that broke me completely. I know you didn't kill David, baby. I know it in my heart, the same way I knew you were going to be a good man when you were just a little boy helping me in the garden. Don't you ever give up fighting for the truth. Don't you ever let them convince you that being in prison makes you guilty. You are my son, and I raised you to be honest and kind and strong. When you get out and you will get out, I want you to live the life you deserve, find love again, maybe become a grandfather someday. And when you do, tell those babies about their great-grandmother who never stopped believing in justice. I held that letter and sobbed like I hadn't cried since my first night in prison. Tony sat quietly on his bunk, giving me space to grieve, while making sure no one else in the cell block could see my breakdown. In prison, showing emotional vulnerability could be dangerous, but Tony had become enough of a brother to protect me during my weakest moment. The funeral took place on a Saturday morning, while I was locked in my cell during mandatory count. I wasn't allowed to attend, wasn't permitted to say goodbye to the woman who had sacrificed so much to support me. Carmen later told me that only a handful of people attended Helen's sister and brother-in-law, a few neighbors from her old church, and surprisingly, Mrs. Patterson from the prison library, who had driven down to pay her respects to a woman she'd never met, but whose dedication to her son had impressed her. Your mother was a remarkable woman, Mrs. Patterson told me when I returned to work the following Monday. Anyone who could raise a son who teaches literacy to convicted felons while maintaining his innocence for 13 years must have been something special. The grief threatened to destroy me completely. For weeks, I couldn't concentrate on anything. The legal research that had consumed my days, not the teaching that had given my life meaning, not even the basic routines that had kept me sane. I stopped showering regularly, stopped eating meals, stopped participating in any activities that weren't absolutely required. Tony finally confronted me after I'd spent 3 straight days lying on my bunk, staring at the ceiling. You planning to die in here? Because that's what it looks like from where I'm sitting. Maybe that would be easier. Easier for who? You think your mother spent 13 years visiting this hellhole just so you could give up the minute she died? She was the only person who believed in me. The only person who thought I was worth fighting for. Bullshit. You've got a whole classroom of men who think you're worth something. Miguel sends you Christmas cards from the outside. James named his son after you. Mrs. Patterson requests you specifically for the literacy program. Your mother wasn't the only person who saw value in you. She was just the loudest about it. Tony was right, but grief doesn't respond to logic. I'd defined myself for 13 years as Helen Rivera's son, the man whose mother never stopped believing in his innocence. Without her, I wasn't sure who I was or why I should keep fighting. The turning point came when I found a package in my cell, Helen's personal effects, that Carmen had been allowed to send me. Most of it was simple, photographs from my childhood, a few pieces of jewelry she'd wanted me to have, some religious medals she'd collected over the years. But at the bottom of the box was something that stopped my heart. Helen had kept every letter I'd written to her during my incarceration, organized chronologically in 3 thick folders. 13 years of correspondence, from my earliest desperate pleas for help to my more recent updates about my teaching work and legal research. But she'd also kept copies of every letter she'd written to me, creating a complete record of our relationship during my imprisonment. Reading her letters in sequence, I could see how her faith in me had never wavered, even as her health declined, and her hope for my quick exoneration faded. In letter after letter, she expressed pride in my work with other inmates, encouragement for my legal efforts, and absolute certainty that truth would eventually prevail. "I may not live to see you walk free," she'd written in one of her final letters, "but I believe with all my heart that you will be exonerated. When that day comes, I want you to remember that your mother never doubted you for a single second. I want you to remember that even in the darkest place, you found ways to help other people and make the world a little better. That's the man I raised, and that's the man who will walk out of prison with his head held high." That night, I made a promise to Helen's memory. I would not give up. I would not let grief destroy the 13 years she'd invested in keeping me alive and fighting. I would prove my innocence, not just for my own sake, but to honor the faith she'd shown in me when no one else would. I had no idea that within 2 years, her faith would be vindicated in ways neither of us could have imagined. Using what little money Helen had left, me her life savings of $12,000, carefully saved from her Social Security checks, hired a new lawyer. Amanda Foster was young, idealistic, and specialized in wrongful conviction cases. Most importantly, she was willing to take a fresh look at evidence that everyone else considered settled. "I've read your file," Amanda told me during our first phone conversation. "There are some things about your case that don't make sense. I'd like to investigate further." For the first time since Helen's death, I felt something resembling hope. Year 13 brought the first real hope I'd experienced since my conviction. Amanda Foster was unlike any lawyer I'd worked with before, methodical, skeptical of official narratives, and genuinely committed to uncovering the truth, rather than simply filing appeals. Our phone conversations gave me something I hadn't felt in over a decade. The sense that someone with actual legal expertise believed my case deserved serious investigation. "I've been reviewing wrongful convictions for 8 years, Amanda told me during one of our early conversations. "Your case has several red flags that experienced defense attorneys should have caught. The timeline doesn't quite work, the physical evidence has some inconsistencies, and that witness testimony feels rehearsed." Amanda's first breakthrough came when she requested the original case files from the prosecutor's office, buried in boxes of documents that Robert Kim had apparently never thoroughly examined. She found discrepancies in the police reports that raised serious questions about the investigation's integrity. The initial crime scene photos show evidence markers in different positions than the photos taken later that same day, Amanda explained. Either the crime scene techs were incredibly sloppy, or someone moved evidence between photo sessions, but it was Amanda's decision to hire a private investigator that led to the anonymous letter with David Martinez's handwriting, the piece of evidence that would eventually crack my case wide open. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, 13 years and 1 month after David's death. A guard handed it to me during mail call, and I immediately noticed that it bore no return address and had been postmarked from Phoenix and Usual. Since most of my correspondence came from Amanda's office in Flagstaff, inside was a single sheet of paper with handwriting that made my hands shake as I read it. "Marcus, no, you didn't kill me, because I'm not dead. People wanted both of us gone, but they needed one to take the blame for the other's disappearance. You were always the more responsible one, so you became the patsy. The witness lied. The evidence was planted. Look into Marco Santelli and his connections to our business debt. The people who did this have money and power, but they made mistakes. Find Alina Rodriguez's bank records from February 2009. I'm sorry I can't do more to help, but coming forward now would put my family in danger. Keep fighting." I read the letter 5 times before the full implications hit me. David Martinez, my supposedly murdered business partner, was alive. Somewhere out there, he was living under an assumed identity while I rotted in prison for his murder. The handwriting was unmistakably his. I'd seen it on thousands of invoices, contracts, and personal notes over the years. My first instinct was to call Amanda immediately, but something made me hesitate. If David was alive and hiding, there had to be a reason he couldn't come forward openly. The letter mentioned threats to his family, connections to dangerous people, and evidence of a conspiracy involving organized crime figures. When I did call Amanda, her reaction was professionally skeptical, but personally intrigued. "Marcus, you understand that anyone could have written this letter. David's handwriting samples are in the court record. Someone could have practiced copying his style. Amanda, I worked with David for 6 years. I know his handwriting better than my own. This isn't a forgery, it's him. Even if it is genuine, a letter from someone claiming to be David Martinez isn't going to overturn your conviction. We need corroborating evidence, official documentation, something that proves the letter writer actually is David." But Amanda agreed to follow up on the leads mentioned in the letter. Marco Santelli was a name that had never appeared in my original trial, despite David's gambling debts being a known factor in our business relationship. If Santelli was involved in David's disappearance, that would explain why the police investigation had focused so narrowly on me. I'm going to have my investigator look into Santelli's background and any connections he might have had to your business. Amanda told me, I'm also going to see what we can find out about Elena Rodriguez's financial situation around the time of the trial. The investigation that followed would take months, but Amanda's team began uncovering information that should have been discovered during my original defense. Marco Santelli was indeed a loan shark who operated throughout the Phoenix area, specializing in gambling debts and construction industry loans. Several of his associates had criminal records involving intimidation, assault, and financial fraud. More importantly, Amanda's forensic accountant discovered that Elena Rodriguez had made several large cash deposits in the weeks following David's death, deposits that totaled nearly $50,000 and had never been reported as income on her tax returns. Where does a warehouse district cleaning lady get $50,000 in cash? Amanda asked during one of our phone calls. And why does she deposit it in small amounts over several weeks instead of all at once? The pattern suggested payment for services rendered specifically, payment for false testimony that had helped convict an innocent man. If Elena had been paid to lie about witnessing me threaten David, then my entire conviction was built on perjured testimony and fabricated evidence. But proving Elena's testimony was false required more than financial records. Amanda needed to find connections between Elena and the people who had orchestrated David's fake death, connections that would demonstrate a conspiracy to frame me for a murder that had never actually occurred. The breakthrough came when Amanda's investigator discovered that Elena Rodriguez had worked for a cleaning service that had contracts with several businesses owned by Marco Santelli's associates. One of those businesses was a security company that specialized in surveillance equipment, exactly the kind of company that could have manipulated the warehouse security footage that had been used against me. We're building a circumstantial case that someone paid Elena Rodriguez to give false testimony, Amanda explained. But we still need more evidence. We need to prove that David Martinez is actually alive, and we need to find the people who orchestrated this conspiracy. The letter had mentioned that David was living under an assumed identity, possibly in witness protection or hiding from the same people who had wanted him dead. But locating someone who had been deliberately hidden for 13 years would require resources and expertise that Amanda's small practice couldn't provide. That's when she made the decision that would change everything. She contacted the FBI. If David Martinez is alive, and this is a conspiracy involving organized crime, then this case is bigger than a simple wrongful conviction, Amanda told me. This is potential witness tampering, perjury, evidence manipulation, and obstruction of justice on a federal level. The FBI's initial response was skeptical. Agents received dozens of letters from convicted criminals claiming innocence and alleging vast conspiracies. But Amanda's presentation was thorough and professional, supported by financial evidence and forensic analysis that suggested serious prosecutorial misconduct. They're going to review the case, Amanda told me after her meeting with federal agents. No promises, but they've agreed to look at Elena Rodriguez's financial records and investigate any connections to Marco Santelli. For the first time in 13 years, I allowed myself to hope that the truth might actually surface. David's letter had opened a door that I'd thought was permanently closed. But walking through that door would require proving a conspiracy so complex and far-reaching that even I found it hard to believe. Somewhere out there, my best friend was alive and living with the knowledge that his cowardice had cost me 13 years of freedom. Somewhere out there, the people who had orchestrated his fake death were confident that their perfect crime would never be discovered. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Amanda Foster's private investigator, Jake Morrison, was a former police detective who specialized in cold cases and had a reputation for uncovering evidence that others missed. When Amanda hired him to investigate Elena Rodriguez's background, neither of them expected to uncover a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Phoenix's criminal underworld. The private investigator's report that Jake delivered 6 weeks after taking the case read like something from a crime thriller. Elena Rodriguez wasn't just a simple warehouse worker who had witnessed an argument. She was a carefully placed asset with connections to organized crime figures who had been planning David's fake death for months. Elena Rodriguez moved to the warehouse district in January 2009. Exactly 1 month before David Martinez's disappearance, Jake explained during a 3-way phone call with Amanda and me. She'd been living in Tucson for 15 years before that, working steady jobs and paying her bills on time. The sudden move to Phoenix doesn't make sense unless someone was paying her to relocate. The financial investigation revealed an even more damning pattern. Elena's bank records showed regular cash deposits of $2,000 every month from February 2009 through August 2012, payments that stopped abruptly after my appeals had been exhausted and my conviction became final. Someone was paying Elena Rodriguez a monthly salary for 3.5 years, Amanda said. That's not a one-time payment for false testimony, that's a long-term contract to keep quiet about what really happened. But the most shocking discovery came when Jake traced Elena's employment history. The cleaning service she worked for was owned by a subsidiary of Santelli Enterprises, Marco Santelli's legitimate business front. Elena hadn't just witnessed David's and my argument by coincidence. She'd been specifically placed in that location to provide false testimony when needed. Elena Rodriguez was a professional witness, Jake explained. She'd been used in at least 3 other cases where Santelli's associates needed someone to testify about events they claimed to have observed. In each case, her testimony helped convict people who were probably innocent of the specific crimes they were charged with. The security camera tampering was even more sophisticated than we'd initially suspected. Jake's forensic analysis revealed that the timestamps on the warehouse footage had been altered using professional-grade editing software, and that several crucial minutes of recording had been completely removed. The original footage would have shown David Martinez leaving the warehouse alive, Jake told us. Instead, the edited version makes it look like Marcus entered alone and David never left. Someone with serious technical expertise and expensive equipment created this false evidence. The breakthrough in identifying that expertise came when Jake discovered that Santelli's security company had been hired to install and maintain the warehouse's surveillance system 6 months before David's disappearance. They'd had access to the equipment, the technical knowledge to manipulate recordings, and a clear motive to frame me for David's murder. But perhaps the most damning evidence was what Jake found in Elena Rodriguez's current life. After receiving her final payment in 2012, Elena had moved 3 times, first to Las Vegas, then to Denver, and finally to a small town in Wyoming where she lived under a slightly altered name. Each move had been funded by large cash payments that left no paper trail. She's been relocated by professional handlers, Jake concluded. Elena Rodriguez is in what amounts to an unofficial witness protection program, hidden from anyone who might want to question her about her false testimony. Amanda used this evidence to strengthen her case with the FBI, but the federal investigation moved slowly. Agents had to verify Jake's findings independently, and they were reluctant to pursue a case that would require admitting that. Federal prosecutors had relied on fabricated evidence to convict an innocent man. The pressure increased when Amanda discovered that Marco Santelli himself was already under federal investigation for money laundering and racketeering. David's gambling debts, which had seemed like a personal problem between business partners, were actually part of a larger pattern of extortion and intimidation that Santelli used to control legitimate businesses. David Martinez owed Santelli over $200,000 in gambling debts, Amanda explained during one of our conversations. But he wasn't just a victim, he was scheduled to testify in a federal case against Santelli's operation. David had been keeping detailed records of his gambling activities, and the FBI was planning to use his testimony to prove their money laundering charges. This revelation completely changed the motive for David's fake death. Santelli hadn't just wanted to collect a gambling debt, he'd needed to eliminate a witness who could have destroyed his entire criminal enterprise. But simply killing David would have made him a martyr, whose testimony could still be used posthumously. Instead, Santelli had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to discredit David as a murder victim, while framing his business partner as the killer. It was brilliant. In a twisted way, Amanda said. David disappears, which eliminates him as a witness. Marcus gets convicted of murder, which destroys his credibility if he ever tries to testify about David's gambling debts. And the real body they planted in the desert belongs to someone whose death would never be seriously investigated. The body found in the desert and identified as David Martinez had actually belonged to a homeless man named Robert Chen, who had been murdered by Santelli's associates specifically to provide a corpse for their conspiracy. Chen's dental records had been altered, and his fingerprints had been surgically modified to match David's. The level of planning and resources required for such an operation suggested that this wasn't Santelli's first attempt at faking someone's death. We're not just looking at witness tampering and perjury, Amanda told me during one of our final conversations before the FBI took over the case completely. We're looking at multiple homicides, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and probably federal racketeering charges. This case is going to bring down Santelli's entire organization. But the most important question remained unanswered. Where was David Martinez? If he was alive and hiding from Santelli's organization, how could the FBI locate him safely? And would he be willing to testify about the conspiracy that had destroyed my life and ended Robert Chen's? The answer came from an unexpected source. Jake's investigation had uncovered communications between Santelli's associates discussing David's relocation to the Pacific Northwest under federal witness protection. The FBI had been hiding David Martinez for 13 years, using him as an informant against organized crime, while allowing an innocent man to serve life in prison for his murder. The federal government knew you were innocent, Amanda told me, her voice filled with outrage. They've known for 13 years, but they prioritized their investigation over your freedom. David Martinez has been living under the name Daniel Morrison in Portland, Oregon, with a new identity and federal protection. The revelation that federal agents had knowingly allowed my wrongful conviction to continue was almost as devastating as the original injustice. David was alive and safe while I'd lost my family, my freedom, and 13 years of my life. But his existence also meant that my exoneration was now inevitable. Amanda filed emergency motions with both state and federal courts, demanding David's immediate testimony and my release pending a new trial. The FBI, faced with evidence of their own misconduct, could no longer hide the truth about David Martinez's survival and my innocence. For the first time in 13 years, I began to believe that I might actually walk out of Millbrook Correctional Facility as a free man. The discovery that David Martinez had been living in federal witness protection under the name Daniel Morrison sent shockwaves through both the legal system and the media. Amanda Foster worked 18-hour days preparing motions and coordinating with federal prosecutors who were suddenly scrambling to explain how they'd allowed an innocent man to serve 13 years for a murder that never occurred. The federal witness protection records that Amanda obtained through court order painted a disturbing picture of institutional negligence and calculated cover-up. David Martinez had been relocated to Portland, Oregon in March 2009, just weeks after my conviction, and had been living there under federal protection ever since. The records showed that FBI agents had known from the beginning that I was innocent, but had decided my wrongful conviction was an acceptable cost for maintaining their long-term investigation into Marcos Santelli's criminal enterprise. According to these documents, David Martinez provided crucial testimony that led to the conviction of 12 organized crime figures. Amanda explained during a phone call that left me speechless with rage. The FBI considered him too valuable as an informant to reveal his survival, even though they knew you were serving life for his supposed murder. The federal prosecutor assigned to review my case, Sarah Washington, was a 20-year veteran who had built her reputation on ethical conduct and dedication to justice. When she reviewed the evidence Amanda had compiled, her reaction was swift and decisive. "This is the worst case of prosecutorial misconduct I've seen in my career," Washington told Amanda during their first meeting. "We have federal agents who knowingly allowed perjured testimony to stand, prosecutors who built a case on fabricated evidence, and a witness protection program that was used to cover up crimes rather than solve them. The Innocence Project, which had rejected my case multiple times over the years, suddenly became very interested in my situation. My conviction had all the elements that made for compelling media coverage: organized crime, conspiracy, federal government cover-up, and an innocent man who had spent over a decade in prison while his supposed victim lived comfortably under federal protection. Your case is going to change how witness protection programs operate," the Innocence Project director told Amanda. "Federal agencies can never again prioritize their investigations over the freedom of innocent citizens." But the most challenging aspect of building my exoneration case was convincing David Martinez to testify. After 13 years of hiding from Marcos Santelli's organization, David was terrified of exposing himself and his new family to potential retaliation. The FBI had relocated him, given him a new identity, and helped him build a successful life. As Daniel Morrison, construction contractor and father of 3, he's been living in Portland with a wife and children who have no idea about his past, Amanda explained. "Coming forward to testify means destroying the life he's built and potentially putting his family in danger." Federal prosecutors offered David continued protection in exchange for his testimony, but he initially refused to cooperate. It took pressure from his own conscience and a direct appeal from Amanda before he agreed to a carefully orchestrated return to Arizona. The media attention surrounding my case intensified when news leaked that federal authorities were preparing to exonerate a man who had served 13 years for a murder victim who was actually alive and living under government protection. Cable news programs ran specials about wrongful convictions and government accountability. Legal experts debated how such a massive failure of the justice system could have occurred. "This case represents everything wrong with how we prioritize law enforcement goals over individual rights," one prominent defense attorney told CNN. "Marcus Rivera's life was sacrificed to protect a federal investigation, and that's absolutely unconscionable." The public pressure helped motivate federal prosecutors to fast-track my case, but it also created new challenges. Marcos' organization, which had remained relatively dormant since his arrest 2 years earlier, suddenly became active again as news of David's survival spread. The FBI received credible intelligence that contracts had been issued for both David's death and mine. "They want to eliminate both of you before this case goes to trial," Agent Patricia Collins told Amanda during a security briefing. "David because He can testify about the original conspiracy. And Marcus, because his exoneration will expose the entire operation. The threat forced the FBI to place both David and me under protective custody, while prosecutors prepared their case. For me, that meant transfer from Millbrook to a secure federal facility, where I was held in isolation for my own safety. It was frustrating to be so close to freedom, yet still locked in a cell, but I understood the precautions were necessary. During this period, I finally had my first conversation with David Martinez in over 13 years. The phone call was monitored by federal agents and limited to 30 minutes, but it was enough to begin healing wounds that had festered for more than a decade. "Marcus, I am so sorry," David said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I wanted to come forward so many times, but they told me you were safe in prison and that exposing myself would get both of us killed. David, I spent 13 years believing you were dead. I grieved for you. I blamed myself for not protecting you. I know. I've been following your case through news reports and court documents. I know about your mother, about your family. I know what my cowardice cost you." The conversation was painful, but necessary. David explained how Santelli's organization had approached him with an ultimatum: fake his death and disappear, or watch his family be murdered. The plan had required a patsy to take the blame for his murder, and my presence at the warehouse had made me the perfect candidate. "They told me it would just be temporary," David said, "that once their investigation was complete, they'd reveal the truth and clear your name. But the investigation kept expanding, and the FBI kept finding new uses for my testimony. Years passed, and it became easier to let everyone believe I was dead. What about your family, Maria and the twins? That was the hardest part, knowing they were grieving, knowing they believed you killed me. But Santelli's people had threatened them specifically. The only way to keep them safe was to stay dead." David's explanation helped me understand his choices, but it didn't eliminate the anger I felt over 13 lost years. He had chosen his safety and his family's protection over my freedom, and that choice had cost me everything I valued most. The preparation for my exoneration hearing involved dozens of law enforcement agencies, prosecutors, and legal experts. Amanda worked with federal attorneys to ensure that every aspect of the conspiracy was documented and that the evidence against Santelli's organization was preserved for future prosecutions. "We're not just seeking your exoneration," Amanda told me. "We're building a case that will send Marco Santelli and his associates to federal prison for the rest of their lives. Your wrongful conviction is just one piece of a much larger criminal conspiracy." The hearing was scheduled for March 15, 2024, exactly 15 years after my conviction, and 15 years to the day after David's fake death. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone involved in the case. 15 years ago, Marco Santelli thought he'd committed the perfect crime. Federal Prosecutor Washington said during a press conference announcing the hearing. He eliminated a witness, framed an innocent man, and corrupted the justice system. But the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. As the date approached, I allowed myself to hope that my nightmare was finally ending, but I also understood that my exoneration was just the beginning. Rebuilding a life after 13 years in prison would require strength I wasn't sure I possessed, and reconnecting with children who barely remembered me would be the greatest challenge of all. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Marco Santelli, facing federal racketeering charges that could result in multiple life sentences, decided to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a plea deal. Marco Santelli's signed confession was the smoking gun that Amanda and federal prosecutors needed to prove the entire conspiracy and secure my immediate exoneration. Santelli had been arrested 6 months earlier on unrelated money laundering charges, but the investigation into my wrongful conviction had exposed the full scope of his criminal enterprise. Faced with evidence linking him to multiple murders, witness tampering, and federal corruption, Santelli made the calculation that cooperation might save him from death row. Santelli's looking at the needle, Agent Patricia Collins explained to Amanda during a briefing. He's responsible for at least 6 murders that we can prove, including Robert Chen, the homeless man whose body was used to fake David Martinez's death. His only chance of avoiding execution is to give us everything he knows about the conspiracy. The confession process took 3 weeks, with federal prosecutors carefully documenting every detail of Santelli's operation. His signed statement read, like a blueprint for corrupting the justice system, revealing how organized crime had infiltrated legitimate businesses, law enforcement agencies, and even the Federal Witness Protection Program. According to Santelli's confession, the plan to frame me for David's murder had been in development for months before it was executed. David's gambling debts had given Santelli leverage over him, but David's agreement to testify in a federal case had made him too dangerous to simply kill. Martinez was scheduled to testify about our money laundering operation, Santelli admitted in his statement. His gambling records showed how we used his construction business to clean drug money. If he testified, it would have brought down our entire Phoenix operation. The confession revealed that Santelli's organization had infiltrated the warehouse district specifically to position Alina Rodriguez as a witness to my supposed crime. They'd studied my business relationship with David, identified our financial problems and personal tensions, and calculated that I would make a believable suspect for his murder. Rivera was perfect. Santelli's confession continued. He had motive, opportunity, and access to the crime scene. His fingerprints were already all over the warehouse from legitimate business activities. All we needed was to stage the scene and make sure our witness saw what we wanted her to see. The murder of Robert Chen, the homeless man whose body had been used to fake David's death, was described in chilling detail. Santelli's associates had specifically targeted Chen because he had no family, no fixed address, and no one who would seriously investigate his disappearance. They'd killed him with the same type of weapon that would later be planted at the warehouse, ensuring that forensic evidence would support their fabricated timeline. We altered his dental records and fingerprints to match Martinez, Santelli confessed. It cost us $50,000 to find a doctor willing to do the work, but it was worth it to make the body identification stick. The confession also revealed the extent of the evidence tampering that had secured my conviction. Security company had not only altered the warehouse surveillance footage, but had also planted additional evidence throughout the crime scene. My fingerprints had been lifted from items I'd touched during legitimate business visits and transferred to the murder. Weapon-using techniques developed by corrupt forensics experts. Everything the jury saw was fake, Santelli admitted. The blood spatter, the struggle patterns, the timeline, all of it was staged to support our story. Rivera never killed anybody. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Perhaps most damning was Santelli's description of how Alina Rodriguez had been recruited and trained for her false testimony. She hadn't just been paid to lie, she'd been coached by professionals who specialized in creating believable witness accounts. Rodriguez practiced her story for weeks, the confession revealed. We showed her videos of Rivera and Martinez together, taught her their mannerisms and speech patterns, made sure she could describe their argument in detail. By the time she testified, she almost believed it herself. The confession explained why Alina had been relocated multiple times after my conviction. Santelli's organization had wanted to keep her away from anyone who might question her testimony or discover the payments she'd received. Her moves to Las Vegas, Denver, and finally, Wyoming had all been funded and orchestrated by professional handlers who specialized in hiding witnesses. But perhaps the most shocking revelation in confession was the extent of federal complicity in my wrongful conviction. FBI agents hadn't just known that David was alive. They'd actively participated in maintaining the cover-up to protect their long-term investigation. The feds knew Rivera was innocent from day one, Santelli confessed. But they needed Martinez as a witness against our organization, and they couldn't expose him without blowing their case. They made a deal with the devil, and Rivera paid the price. David Martinez's reaction to Santelli's confession was captured in a recorded conversation with federal prosecutors. For the first time in 13 years, David fully understood how his cowardice had enabled my wrongful conviction and allowed Santelli's organization to corrupt the justice system. "I thought I was protecting my family," David said, his voice barely audible on the recording. "I thought the FBI would eventually clear Marcus once their investigation was complete. I never realized they were planning to let him rot in prison indefinitely." David's agreement to testify became the final element prosecutors needed to ensure my exoneration and Santelli's conviction. Despite the risks to his safety and his family's security, David finally found the courage to take responsibility for his role in the conspiracy. "I destroyed Marcus Rivera's life to save my own," David admitted in his statement. "I let him spend 13 years in prison for a crime that never happened. I can't undo that damage, but I can make sure the people responsible face justice." The media coverage of Santelli's confession was intense and unforgiving. Legal experts called it one of the most comprehensive exposures of judicial corruption in modern American history. Civil rights organizations demanded investigations into how federal agencies had prioritized criminal investigations over the freedom of innocent citizens. "This case proves that our justice system is fundamentally broken," one prominent attorney told reporters. "When federal agents can knowingly allow an innocent man to serve life in prison to protect their investigations, we've lost any claim to moral authority." The confession also triggered investigations into other cases where Santelli's organization might have corrupted the legal process. Federal prosecutors identified at least 12 other convictions that had relied on evidence or testimony connected to Santelli's criminal enterprise, raising the possibility that dozens of innocent people had been wrongfully convicted. Amanda Foster worked around the clock, preparing for my exoneration hearing. But Santelli's confession had made the outcome inevitable. No court could uphold a conviction that had been based entirely on fabricated evidence and perjured testimony. "We're not just seeking your exoneration," Amanda told me during our final phone call before the hearing. "We're seeking a complete acknowledgement that the system failed you, and that you deserve compensation for every day you spent in prison." On March 14, 2024, one day before my exoneration hearing, I received a letter from David Martinez. It was the first direct communication between us since his anonymous note had started the investigation that would prove my innocence. "Marcus," the letter began, "tomorrow you will walk free, and I will finally be able to look at myself in the mirror again. I know my apologies can't give you back the 13 years I cost you, but I want you to know that I will spend the rest of my life trying to make amends for my cowardice. You were my best friend, and I failed you in the worst possible way. I hope someday you can forgive me." As I prepared for what I hoped would be my last night in a prison cell, I thought about David's letter and Santelli's confession. The truth was finally going to be revealed, and the people responsible for destroying my life were going to face justice. But I also knew that my real challenge was just beginning. Walking out of prison as an exonerated man would be only the first step in rebuilding a life that had been shattered by corruption and betrayal. The flight from Portland to Phoenix was the longest 3 hours of David Martinez's life. After 13 years of living as Daniel Morrison's successful contractor, devoted husband, and father of 3, he was returning to Arizona to face the consequences of decisions that had destroyed his best friend's life and corrupted the justice system. David's sworn affidavit, which federal prosecutors had taken in Portland before his return, documented not just the facts of his fake death, but the psychological toll of living with guilt while an innocent man rotted in prison. The statement was a confession, an apology, and a testament to how cowardice could cascade into unimaginable harm. "I want to be completely clear about my role in this conspiracy," David's affidavit began. "I was not an innocent victim who was forced into hiding. I was a coward who chose my own safety over my best friend's freedom, and I compounded that betrayal by remaining silent for 13 years, while Marcus Rivera served time for a crime that never occurred. The journey that had led David to that airplane seat began in February 2009, when Marco Santelli's associates had presented him with an ultimatum: cooperate with their plan to fake his death, or watch his family be systematically murdered. David's gambling debts had made him vulnerable, but his agreement to testify in a federal case had made him a threat that Santelli couldn't ignore. They showed me photographs of my wife and daughters, David explained in his affidavit. Pictures taken outside their school, at the grocery store, in our backyard. The message was clear: disappear voluntarily, or they would make my family disappear permanently. The plan had been sophisticated beyond anything David could have imagined. Santelli's organization had spent months preparing for David's fake death, identifying Marcus as the perfect patsy, positioning Alina Rodriguez as a witness, and coordinating with corrupt federal agents who saw an opportunity to protect a valuable informant. I was told that Marcus would be arrested and convicted, but that the FBI would eventually reveal the truth once their investigation was complete. David's statement continued. I was told that his imprisonment would be temporary, maybe 2 or 3 years, and that he would be compensated for the inconvenience. I believed them because I wanted to believe them. The reality of witness protection had been both better and worse than David had expected. Better because the FBI had genuinely protected him and his family, relocating them to Oregon and providing new identities that allowed them to build successful, normal lives. Worse, because every day of that normal life was built on the knowledge that his best friend was suffering for crimes he hadn't committed. I tried to convince myself that Marcus was safer in prison than he would be if Santelli's organization knew he was innocent. David admitted. I told myself that prison would protect him from retaliation, that he was getting an education and finding purpose in teaching other inmates. I created elaborate justifications for my cowardice, but I knew they were lies. David's new life as Daniel Morrison had been carefully constructed by federal handlers who specialized in creating believable identities. He'd been given a work history in construction, financial records showing steady employment, and even manufactured references from previous employers. Within 6 months of his relocation, he'd started his own contracting business and begun dating a local teacher named Rebecca Chen. Rebecca knew I had a past I couldn't discuss, but she accepted that I was in witness protection and never pressed for details, David explained. We married 2 years after we met, and she became pregnant with our first child shortly after that. Building a life with her was the only thing that kept me sane during those early years. The birth of David's first child, with Rebecca, daughter they named Emma, had triggered a psychological crisis that nearly drove him to reveal the truth about his identity. Holding his newborn daughter, while knowing that Marcus's children had grown up believing their father was a murderer, became unbearable. I wrote dozens of letters to newspapers, to Marcus's lawyers, to civil rights organizations, David confessed. I would write them in the middle of the night when I couldn't sleep, pouring out the truth about the conspiracy and begging someone to investigate Marcus's case. But I never sent them. Every time I tried, I would think about Emma, about Rebecca, about the life we were building together. I would think about Santelli's threats and convince myself that revealing the truth would get us all killed. The years had passed with agonizing slowness, each one making David's eventual confession more difficult and more necessary. He'd followed Marcus's case obsessively, reading every court filing and news article, watching his friends' appeals get denied, while knowing he possessed the evidence that could free him instantly. I knew when Marcus's mother died, David revealed. I knew when his wife divorced him and when she remarried. I knew when his children were adopted by another man and had their names changed. I watched my best friend lose everything while I built a new family and a successful business. The guilt was overwhelming, but not overwhelming enough to make me brave. The turning point had come when David's son Michael, named after Marcus's son, though Rebecca never knew the significance, had started asking questions about his father's past and family history. At 8 years old, Michael was the same age that Marcus's son had been when his father was convicted of murder. Michael wanted to know about his grandparents, about aunts and uncles, about where he came from. David explained, I realized I was raising my children on a foundation of lies, just like I had built my entire adult life on lies. They deserved to know the truth about their father, and Marcus deserved to be free. The decision to cooperate with federal prosecutors had been the hardest choice of David's life, but also the most necessary. His marriage to Rebecca wouldn't survive the revelation that their entire relationship was built on false identity and that his cowardice had cost an innocent man 13 years of freedom. His children would grow up knowing their father was responsible for one of the worst miscarriages of justice in modern American history. I'm destroying the life I built in Oregon to give Marcus back the life I stole from him in Arizona, David concluded in his affidavit. It's not a fair trade, nothing could be, but it's the only way I can begin to make amends for 13 years of cowardice. The media coverage of David's return to Arizona was intense and unforgiving. Reporters camped outside the federal building where he was giving his testimony, and cable news programs ran endless speculation about how someone could remain silent while their best friend served time for their fake murder. David Martinez is either the most cowardly man in America or the most tragically misguided, one legal commentator observed. His decision to remain silent for 13 years enabled one of the worst wrongful convictions in our nation's history, but other experts focused on the impossible choices David had faced and the sophisticated manipulation by Santelli's organization and corrupt federal agents. Martinez was caught between organized crime threats and federal pressure, a former FBI agent explained during a television interview. He was told that revealing the truth would get his family killed and that Marcus Rivera would eventually be exonerated through proper channels. He made the wrong choice, but it's important to understand the context in which that choice was made. David's reunion with Marcus was scheduled for the day before the exoneration hearing. After 13 years of believing his best friend was dead, Marcus would finally see David alive and hear directly from him about the conspiracy that had destroyed both their lives in different ways. The meeting took place in a secure conference room at the federal courthouse, with attorneys and FBI agents present to ensure everyone's safety. When David walked through the door, Marcus later said, "It was like seeing a ghost made flesh older, grayer, but unmistakably the man he had mourned for over a decade." "Marcus," David said, his voice breaking as soon as he saw his former partner, "I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry for what I did to you." The conversation that followed was recorded by federal agents and would later be used as evidence in prosecuting the remaining members of Santelli's organization. But for both men, it was simply two friends trying to process the unimaginable circumstances that had torn their lives apart. "I thought you were dead," Marcus told David. "I grieved for you. I blamed myself for not protecting you. Your wife looked at me like I was a monster who had murdered her husband. I know. I watched the news coverage of the trial. I saw Maria's victim impact statement. I wanted to run into that courtroom and stop it, but I was terrified. I convinced myself that the FBI would eventually clear you, that my testimony against Santelli would be worth the temporary injustice." Temporary. David, I lost 13 years. I lost my wife, my children, my mother. Ashley and Michael don't even know who I am anymore. The weight of David's choices hung between them like a physical presence. There was no apology sufficient for the damage that had been done, no explanation that could justify 13 years of silence while an innocent man suffered. But there was also genuine love between two men who had been best friends before fear and corruption had driven them apart. Despite everything, Marcus could see the genuine anguish in David's eyes and understand the impossible position he had been placed in by Santelli's threats and federal manipulation. "Tomorrow, I'm going to testify at your exoneration hearing," David promised. "I'm going to tell the world exactly what happened and who was responsible. It won't give you back the years I cost you, but it will clear your name completely." What about your family in Oregon? Rebecca and the kids? I've already lost them. Rebecca filed for divorce when she learned the truth about my identity. The kids are too young to understand now, but someday they'll know their father was responsible for a terrible injustice. I'll have to live with that for the rest of my life. As they prepared to leave that conference room, both men understood that their friendship could never be fully restored. Too much had been lost, too much damage had been done. But they also understood that they were bound together by shared trauma and the need to ensure that the truth finally emerged. Tomorrow, David would take the stand and destroy any remaining doubt about Marcus's innocence, and Marcus would finally walk free, carrying with him both the vindication he had sought for 13 years and the knowledge that even the deepest friendships could be shattered by fear and betrayal. March 15, 2024, exactly 15 years after my conviction, I woke up in a federal holding cell for what I hoped would be the last time. The irony wasn't lost on me that my exoneration hearing was scheduled for the same date as my original sentencing, as if the universe was finally balancing the scales of justice. The media circus outside the Maricopa County Superior Court was unlike anything Phoenix had seen since my original trial. Satellite trucks lined the streets. Reporters from national networks jostled for position, and crowds of supporters carried signs reading "Free Marcus Rivera" and "Justice delayed is justice denied." The case had captured national attention as a symbol of everything wrong with the American justice system. Amanda Foster met me in the holding area an hour before the hearing, her confidence tempered by the magnitude of the moment. We had prepared for this day for months, but the weight of 15 years made every detail feel monumentally important. Today is going to be emotional for everyone, Amanda warned me. David's testimony will be difficult to hear, but it's necessary to establish the complete record of what happened. Are you ready for this? I nodded, though I wasn't sure anyone could be ready to watch their supposed murder. Victim walk into a courtroom to explain how their best friend had been framed for a crime that never occurred. Judge Patricia Holbrook, who had originally sentenced me to life in prison, had recused herself from the exoneration hearing. The case was assigned to Judge Michael Chen, a federal judge with extensive experience in organized crime cases and a reputation for demanding absolute adherence to constitutional principles. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow seating arranged in adjacent rooms where people could watch the proceedings on closed-circuit television. Maria Martinez sat in the front row with her daughters, now 24 years old, and seeing their father's supposed killer potentially walk free. Jennifer was there too, accompanied by Tom Wilson, watching the man whose conviction had destroyed their marriage finally receive the justice she had never believed he deserved. My children, now adults, I barely recognized, sat together in the middle section. Ashley, 25, and a social worker, had driven down from Tucson against Tom Wilson's advice. Michael, 23, and on leave from his military deployment, wore his dress uniform as if attending a formal ceremony. They looked at me with curiosity rather than recognition. Studying the stranger who claimed to be their biological father, the hearing began with federal prosecutor Sarah Washington outlining the scope of the conspiracy that had led to my wrongful conviction. Her presentation was methodical and devastating, walking through 15 years of evidence that proved every aspect of my conviction had been based on fabricated evidence and perjured testimony. Your Honor, this case represents one of the most comprehensive failures of the justice system in modern American history, Washington began. Mr. Rivera was not simply wrongly convicted, he was deliberately framed by a criminal organization with the knowing complicity of federal law enforcement agencies. The first witness was Marco Santelli himself, brought from federal prison to testify about the conspiracy he had orchestrated. Wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackles, Santelli looked nothing like the powerful crime boss who had destroyed my life. His confession was read into the record, but his live testimony added details that made the conspiracy even more chilling. We needed Rivera to take the fall for Martinez's murder, because Martinez was scheduled to testify against our operation. Santelli testified, his voice devoid of emotion. Rivera was perfect. He had motive, opportunity, and access to the crime scene. All we had to do was stage the evidence and make sure our witness told the right story. Alina Rodriguez was brought in under federal marshal protection to recant her false testimony. Now in her 60s, and clearly terrified, Alina admitted that every word of her original testimony had been a lie rehearsed at the direction of Santelli organization. They paid me $50,000 to say I saw Mr. Rivera threaten Mr. Martinez, Alina testified, refusing to look in my direction. They coached me for weeks, showing me videos of the two men so I could describe them accurately. I knew Mr. Rivera was innocent, but they told me he would only serve a few years and then be released when their investigation was complete. But it was David Martinez's testimony that brought the courtroom to complete silence. When the doors opened and David walked in alive, healthy, and bearing only a passing resemblance to the man I had known 15 years earlier, gasps echoed throughout the room. Maria Martinez collapsed in her chair, supported by her daughters who were seeing their supposedly murdered father for the first time since they were 9 years old. "State your name for the record," Judge Chen instructed. "My legal name is Daniel Morrison, but I was born David Martinez. I am the supposed murder victim in this case." David's testimony was comprehensive and heartbreaking. He explained the threats against his family, the FBI's promise that my imprisonment would be temporary, and his 13 years of cowardice while I rotted in prison. His voice broke multiple times as he described watching news coverage of my appeals and my mother's death while remaining safely hidden in Oregon. "I destroyed Marcus Rivera's life to save my own," David testified. "I let him lose his wife, his children, his mother, and 15 years of freedom because I was too afraid to tell the truth. There is no justification for what I did, only explanations that make me sound like the coward I am." The courtroom was riveted as David explained how he had been relocated to Oregon, given a new identity, and helped to build a successful life, while I served time for his fake murder. His description of starting a family with Rebecca, while knowing that my own family had been destroyed by his cowardice, brought tears to the eyes of even the most hardened journalists. When it came time for victim impact statements, Maria Martinez stood to address the court. Her words were directed not at me, but at her supposedly dead husband, who had allowed her to believe she was a widow for 15 years. "I mourned you," Maria said, her voice shaking with rage. "I raised our daughters believing their father was dead. I testified at this man's trial, convinced that he had murdered the love of my life. And all this time, you were alive, building a new family while we suffered. I don't know which betrayal is worse, your fake death, or your 15 years of silence." Ashley Rivera took the stand to give her own statement, speaking publicly about our relationship for the first time since she was 8 years old. "I grew up believing my father was a murderer," Ashley said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her words. "I changed my name to escape that stigma. I built my career helping other people overcome trauma, while carrying the trauma of believing I was the daughter of a killer. Learning that he was innocent doesn't erase those years of shame, but it does give me hope that we might find a way to know each other again." Michael's statement was shorter, but equally powerful. "I joined the military partly to escape the legacy of having a father in prison for murder. I wanted to serve my country and prove that I wasn't defined by his crimes. Today I learned that there were no crimes, only a conspiracy that destroyed our family. I don't know what kind of relationship we can build after all these years, but I'm willing to try." The federal agents who had maintained Vade's protection while knowing of my innocence were not present. Most had been transferred or retired, and those still active had invoked their Fifth Amendment rights, rather than testify about their role in the cover-up. When all testimony was complete, Judge Chen took less than 10 minutes to render his decision. The judge's exoneration order was brief but comprehensive. declaring that my conviction was a travesty of justice enabled by criminal conspiracy and federal misconduct. Mr. Rivera, after reviewing the evidence presented today, this court finds that your conviction was obtained through perjured testimony, fabricated evidence, and prosecutorial misconduct of the most egregious kind. Judge Chen announced, "You are hereby exonerated of all charges, and this court extends its deepest apologies for the failure of the justice system to protect your constitutional rights." The words I had waited 15 years to hear felt surreal when they finally came. As the bailiff removed my shackles for the last time, the courtroom erupted in applause and tears. Amanda Foster embraced me, whispering "You're free" over and over, as if trying to make the reality sink in. David approached me as I stood at the defendant's table, no longer a defendant, but a free man. The media would later describe our embrace as complicated two men bound by shared trauma and damaged friendship, finding a moment of reconciliation despite everything that had been lost. "Thank you for finally telling the truth," I whispered to David as cameras flashed around us. "It's 15 years too late, but I'm glad I could finally do the right thing," he replied. As I walked out of the courthouse as a free man, the crowd outside erupted in cheers. Signs reading "Welcome home, Marcus," and "Justice at last" waved in the afternoon sun. But the person I looked for in that crowd was my mother. Forgetting for a moment that Helen Rivera had died 3 years earlier, still believing in my innocence, but never living to see it proven, the first steps of freedom felt uncertain and overwhelming. After 15 years of controlled movement and restricted choices, the simple act of deciding where to go and what to do felt impossibly complex. But as I stood on those courthouse steps, breathing free air for the first time since 2009, I knew that my real journey was just beginning. I was free. But I was also a 42-year-old man with no home, no family relationships, and no clear path forward. The truth had finally emerged, but learning to live with that truth and helping others do the same would be the work of the rest of my life. My first night of freedom was the strangest experience of my adult life. David and Rebecca's divorce had been finalized weeks earlier, but she had graciously offered her guest room to a man she'd never met, the victim of her ex-husband's 15-year deception. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that the woman whose marriage had been destroyed by David's lies was now housing the man whose life had been destroyed by those same lies. Everything about the outside world felt alien and overwhelming. The smartphone Rebecca lent me had more computing power than the prison's entire computer lab. The television in her living room was impossibly thin and connected to hundreds of channels. Even simple tasks like ordering food or calling for a ride required navigating apps and interfaces that hadn't existed when I was convicted. "Take your time adjusting," Rebecca told me over coffee that first morning. "David prepared me for how disorienting freedom would be for you. He's been researching re-entry programs and psychological support for exonerated prisoners." It was strange to discuss David's preparations for my freedom planning done while he was still hiding in witness protection, still married under a false identity, still allowing me to serve time for his fake murder. But I was grateful for Rebecca's kindness and her willingness to help, despite the impossible circumstances. The media attention was relentless and exhausting. Every network wanted exclusive interviews, publishers offered book deals, and documentary filmmakers pitched their visions for telling my story. Amanda Foster helped screen the requests, but the constant attention made it difficult to process my freedom privately. "You don't owe anyone your story," Amanda reminded me during one of our meetings. "Take time to figure out who you are as a free man before you decide how much of that person you want to share with the world." The civil lawsuit against the state of Arizona and the federal government was already in motion. Wrongful conviction settlements typically averaged between $50,000 and $80,000 per year of imprisonment. But my case involved such egregious misconduct that Amanda's estimate was significantly higher. "We're seeking $8.5 million," Amanda explained. $500,000 for each year you were imprisoned, plus punitive damages for the federal government's role in maintaining your wrongful conviction. The settlement agreement should provide you with enough financial security to rebuild your life however you choose. The money was important. 15 years in prison had left me with no savings, no credit history, and no recent work experience that would qualify me for employment. But no amount of compensation could restore the relationships I'd lost, or the experiences I'd missed. My first visit to my mother's grave was arranged for a quiet Tuesday morning when media attention would be minimal. Helen Rivera was buried in a small Catholic cemetery on the outskirts of Phoenix. Her headstone reading, "Simply beloved mother and grandmother, she never lost faith." I knelt beside her grave and placed the letter she'd written me before her. Death against the headstone, weighed down with a small stone so it wouldn't blow away in the desert wind. "I'm free, Mom," I whispered to the desert air. "You were right. The truth finally came out, just like you always said it would. I wish you could have lived to see this day." The conversation with Ashley and Michael was arranged for the following week at a neutral location, a coffee shop in Scottsdale, where we could talk privately, without media intrusion. Both of my children were adults now, with lives and careers and relationships that had been built entirely during my imprisonment. Ashley was 25, working as a social worker, specializing in family reunification, a career choice that seemed both ironic and prophetic, given our circumstances. She had Jennifer's eyes, but my stubborn chin, and her professional training had taught her to approach our reunion with cautious optimism, rather than unrealistic expectations. "I need you to understand that I don't remember you as a father," Ashley told me honestly. "I have some vague memories of playing in the backyard, and you teaching me to ride a bike. But mostly you're just this absent figure that Mom and Tom told me stories about. Learning that you're innocent doesn't automatically create a relationship between us." Michael was quieter, more guarded. Military training had taught him to process emotions privately, and 15 years of believing his father was a murderer had left him uncertain about how to feel about my exoneration. "I hated you for most of my childhood," Michael admitted. "I hated that other kids whispered about my father being in prison. I hated that I had to change my name to escape your reputation. Learning that you were innocent doesn't erase those feelings overnight. Their honesty was painful, but necessary. I had fantasized during my imprisonment about joyful reunions and instant connections, but the reality was more complex. My children were strangers who shared my DNA, but not my experiences. And building relationships with them would require patience and understanding from all of us. I don't expect anything from either of you," I told them. "I know I can't be the father you needed when you were children. And I know Tom Wilson raised you and earned the title of Dad. But if you're willing, I'd like to try to be some kind of positive presence in your lives going forward." Jennifer's reaction to my exoneration was complicated and difficult for both of us to navigate. She had remarried and built a new life based on the assumption that her first husband was a convicted murderer. My innocence vindicated her initial faith in me, but also highlighted the tragedy of our destroyed marriage. "I believed you were innocent for the first 3 years," Jennifer told me during a private conversation at Amanda's office. "But when the appeals kept getting denied and the evidence seemed so overwhelming, I started to doubt myself. I convinced myself that maybe there were things about you I didn't know, secrets you'd kept from me. I understand why you left. I understand why you had to protect Ashley and Michael from the stigma of having a convicted murderer as a father. Do you forgive me for doubting you, for not waiting longer, for letting Tom adopt the children?" The question was complex and deserved a thoughtful answer. Jennifer had made the best decisions she could with the information available to her. She had prioritized our children's welfare over her loyalty to me. And while that choice had been devastating, it had also been understandable. "I forgive you," I told her. "I forgive all of you. Holding on to anger about decisions made under impossible circumstances won't help any of us move forward." The settlement negotiations concluded after 6 months of legal wrangling. The state of Arizona agreed to pay $4.5 million for my wrongful conviction, while the federal government contributed an additional $4 million for their role in maintaining the cover-up. The settlement agreement also included provisions for psychological counseling, job training, and ongoing legal support. $8.5 million was more money than I had ever imagined possessing, but it felt strange to profit from such a terrible experience. Amanda helped me establish the Rivera Innocence Foundation, using half the settlement to fund legal assistance for other wrongfully convicted individuals. Your case is going to help other innocent people prove their innocence, Amanda explained during the foundation's first board meeting. That's a legacy worth building. The foundation's first client was a man named Carlos Mendez, not the violent inmate I'd known in prison, but a different Carlos Mendez who had been convicted of murder based on eyewitness testimony that new evidence suggested was unreliable. Working to prove his innocence gave me a sense of purpose that simply being free couldn't provide. 6 months after my exoneration, I received an unexpected phone call from Rebecca Chen. David's ex-wife had been following my adjustment to freedom through news coverage and social media posts, and she wanted to offer support from someone who understood the complexities of our situation. David talks about you constantly when he calls the kids, Rebecca told me. He's consumed with guilt about what happened, but he's also proud of the work you're doing with the foundation. He asked me to tell you that he's available if you ever want to talk, not to rebuild your friendship, but to process what happened between you. The conversation with David took place 3 months later at a diner halfway between Phoenix and Los Angeles, where he was working construction jobs and trying to rebuild his life after losing his federal protection. He looked older than his 43 years, gray at the temples, and carrying himself with the weight of someone who had made irreversible mistakes. I know I can't undo what I did to you, David said over coffee that neither of us touched. No, I can't give you back 15 years, or restore your relationship with your family, but I want you to know that I think about it every day, and I'm committed to making whatever amends are possible. The foundation could use someone with construction experience, I told him. We're planning to build transitional housing for exonerated prisoners. It would be unpaid volunteer work, but it might give you a way to contribute to fixing the system that we both suffered under. David's eyes filled with tears, not of relief, but of gratitude for an opportunity to do something meaningful with his guilt and regret. Our friendship would never be what it had been before his fake death destroyed both our lives. Too much had been lost, too much trust had been betrayed, but perhaps we could find a way to work together toward something positive, using our shared trauma to help others who had been failed by the justice system. As I drove home from that meeting, I realized that freedom wasn't just about walking out of prison, it was about choosing how to use the life that had been returned to me. I could spend my remaining years consumed with bitterness over what had been stolen, or I could focus on building something meaningful from the wreckage. The choice, for the first time in 15 years, was entirely mine. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 year after my exoneration, delivered to the Rivera Innocence Foundation office, where I'd been spending most of my days. The return address simply read A. Rivera Wilson, and I recognized Ashley's careful handwriting immediately. Ashley Rivera's letter would become one of my most treasured possessions, not just for what it said, but for what it represented about the possibility of healing relationships that had been shattered by injustice. Dear Marcus, the letter began, using my first name rather than any parental title. I've been thinking about our conversation at the coffee shop for months, trying to figure out how to build a relationship with someone who is technically my father, but feels like a stranger. I think I've figured out where to start. Ashley had been working with families affected by wrongful convictions through her job as a social worker, and the experience had given her insight into the unique challenges facing exonerated individuals and their families. Her letter detailed the research she'd done on family reunification after imprisonment, the statistics on relationship success rates, and the therapeutic approaches that seemed most effective. I don't want to approach this as your daughter trying to reconnect with her father, Ashley wrote. I want to approach this as two adults who share a history and want to build a future relationship. I can't pretend to remember you as a parent, but I can get to know you as a person. The letter included an invitation that stopped my heart. Ashley was getting married in 6 months to a fellow social worker named James Chen, and she wanted me to walk her down the aisle. Tom Wilson has been my dad for 15 years, and he'll always hold that place in my heart, Ashley explained. But you're my biological father, and James and I want to honor that connection at our wedding. It won't erase the years we lost, but it might give us a meaningful starting point for building new memories. I called Ashley immediately after reading the letter, my hands shaking as I dialed her number. Ashley, I just read your letter. Are you sure about the wedding? I don't want to create conflict with Tom or make the day uncomfortable for you. I've already talked to Tom about it. He understands that having you walk me down the aisle doesn't diminish his role in raising me. We can both be part of my life in different ways. The wedding planning process became an unexpected opportunity for our family to learn how to navigate relationships that had been fractured by my wrongful conviction. Ashley insisted on including both Tom Wilson and me in pre-wedding events, creating space for all the father figures in her life to coexist peacefully. Michael's approach to rebuilding our relationship was different but equally meaningful. Military protocol had taught him to approach complex situations systematically, and he treated our reconnection like a mission requiring careful planning and execution. I've been deployed overseas for most of the past year, Michael told me during a video call from his base in Germany. It's given me time to process everything that happened and think about what kind of relationship we might have going forward. Michael's solution was to request leave to spend 2 weeks working with the Rivera Innocence Foundation, using his military skills to help with security assessments and operational planning. It was a practical way for us to spend time together, while contributing to meaningful work. I can't just pretend we're father and son after all these years, Michael explained. But I can work alongside you and see what kind of man you are now. Maybe that's how we build something real between us. The 2 weeks Michael spent at the foundation were transformative for both of us. He brought military precision to our case management systems and helped design security protocols for clients who faced threats from the same criminal organizations that had destroyed their lives. But more importantly, working together gave us a chance to see each other as people, rather than strangers, connected only by DNA. You're not the man I imagined when I was growing up, Michael told me on his last day at the foundation. You're quieter, more thoughtful. You listen before you speak. I can see why Ashley wants to build a relationship with you. The conversation with Jennifer about attending Ashley's wedding was one of the most difficult we'd had since my exoneration. She had supported Ashley's decision to include me in the ceremony, but the prospect of seeing me in a parental role triggered complex emotions about our destroyed marriage and the life we'd lost. I need you to understand that this isn't about us, Jennifer told me during a meeting at Amanda Foster's office. This is about Ashley having the wedding she wants, with all the people who have been important in her life. It doesn't change anything about our past or our future, I understand. I'm grateful that you're supporting Ashley's decision, and I want you to know that I harbor no resentment about your remarriage or the choices you made. You protected our children when I couldn't. Jennifer's current life was stable and happy in ways that our marriage had never achieved, even before my conviction. She and Tom had built a successful family with Ashley, Michael, and their twin daughters, creating the kind of domestic tranquility that had always eluded us during our tumultuous early marriage. Tom has been more of a father to Ashley and Michael than you ever had the chance to be, Jennifer said. Not unkindly, but truthfully. I hope you can find ways to be part of their lives that don't threaten the relationships they've built with him. The relationship that surprised me most was the one that developed with Tom Wilson himself, the man who had married my ex-wife and adopted my children. Approached our first meeting with the practical directness of someone who had spent years dealing with the aftermath of my conviction. "I want to be clear about something," Tom told me, over lunch at a restaurant near his auto shop. "I didn't marry Jennifer to replace you. I married her because I loved her and wanted to help her build a stable life for Ashley and Michael. But I also want you to know that I tried to honor your memory as their biological father, even when everyone believed you were guilty." Tom had kept photo albums from my children's early years, preserving memories of their life before my conviction. He'd answered their questions about their biological father honestly, but without judgment, leaving room for them to form their own opinions about me as they matured. I told them that sometimes good people make terrible mistakes, and that even if you were guilty of murder, it didn't mean you hadn't loved them, Tom explained. "Now that we know you were innocent, I'm glad I took that approach." The wedding took place on a perfect October afternoon at a small venue in Scottsdale, with about 60 guests who represented the complex web of relationships that Ashley had built throughout her life. Tom Wilson walked Ashley halfway down the aisle, then transferred her hand to mine for the final steps to the altar, a symbolic gesture that acknowledged both men's importance in her life. "Thank you for giving me the chance to be part of this," Dea whispered to Ashley as we walked those final steps together. "Thank you for being innocent," she whispered back, and we both laughed despite the tears in our eyes. Michael served as Ashley's man of honor, a role that reflected the close relationship the siblings had maintained despite everything their family had endured. His speech at the reception was both humorous and touching, acknowledging the unique circumstances that had brought everyone together. "Ashley and I grew up thinking our biological father was a murderer," Michael said to the assembled guests. "We learned last year that he was actually the victim of an incredible injustice. Today, we're celebrating not just Ashley's marriage, but the possibility that our family can heal from trauma and build new relationships based on truth rather than lies." The moment that will stay with me forever came during the father dance. Ashley had chosen "Isn't She Lovely" by Stevie Wonder, a song I used to sing to her when she was a baby, though she claimed not to remember those early moments. "I've been researching songs that fathers and daughters dance to," Ashley told me as we swayed to the music. "This one felt right because it's about celebrating someone you love, regardless of the complications that brought you together." As we danced, I thought about my mother Helen, who had died believing in my innocence but never living to see it proven. I thought about the wedding she would have attended, the grandmother role she would have played, the joy she would have felt watching our family slowly rebuild itself. 6 months after the wedding, I received news that completed the circle of healing our family desperately needed. Michael's girlfriend Sarah was pregnant, and they were planning to marry before his next deployment. I would become a grandfather, a role I had never expected to experience after losing so many years with my own children. "We want you to be involved in the baby's life," Michael told me during a phone call from Germany, not as a replacement for Tom, but as their biological grandfather. "Sarah and I think it's important for our child to know their complete family history." The prospect of becoming a grandfather filled me with hope and terror in equal measure. I had missed so much of Ashley and Michael's childhood that the idea of being present for their children's development felt like an incredible gift. But I also worried about my ability to be the kind of grandfather these children would deserve. "Take it one day at a time," Amanda Foster advised me. "You've already proven that you can build meaningful relationships with Ashley and Michael, despite the years you lost. Trust that you can do the same with their children." As I prepared to attend Michael's wedding and meet my future grandchild, I reflected on how much had changed since that anonymous letter had arrived in my prison cell 2 years earlier. I was free, financially secure, and slowly rebuilding relationships with family members who had once been strangers. The truth had finally emerged, and while it couldn't restore the years that had been stolen, it had created space for new beginnings. The little girl who would be born 3 months later would know her grandfather as a man who had survived injustice with dignity, who had built something meaningful from the wreckage of his life, and who had chosen forgiveness over bitterness, despite having every reason to be angry. That legacy felt more valuable than any settlement, money, or legal vindication. 1 year after Ashley's wedding, I stood in the conference room of the Rivera Innocence Foundation, looking out at the Phoenix skyline through windows that would have been unimaginable during my years behind bars. The foundation had grown from a one-man operation in a rented office to a staff of 12 attorneys, investigators, and support specialists working to overturn wrongful convictions across the Southwest. The Rivera Innocence Foundation charter hung framed on the wall behind my desk, the legal document that had transformed my settlement money into a lasting legacy dedicated to helping other innocent people prove their cases and rebuild their lives. In 18 months, we had taken on 43 cases and achieved 7 exonerations, with 12 more cases pending in various courts. "Marcus, your 3 o'clock appointment is here," my assistant Sarah announced through the intercom. Amanda Foster had joined the foundation as our lead attorney after closing her private practice, bringing her expertise in wrongful conviction cases and her deep understanding of how the system could fail innocent people. "The Carson case?" I asked, referring to a man who had served 8 years for a rape he didn't commit before DNA evidence finally cleared him. "No, your other appointment. The personal one." I had forgotten about the personal appointment, but as Amanda walked into my office, I remembered that she had wanted to discuss something important outside of our professional relationship. Over the past 2 years, Amanda and I had developed a friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. But lately, that friendship had been evolving into something deeper and more complex. "I know this might be inappropriate, given our working relationship," Amanda said, settling into the chair across from my desk, "but I've been thinking about us. About whether there might be something between us worth exploring." The possibility of romance had seemed impossible during my early months of freedom. 15 years in prison had left me uncertain about my ability to form intimate relationships, and the trauma of my wrongful conviction had made it difficult to trust anyone completely. But Amanda had been there through every step of my legal battle and my adjustment to freedom, understanding my history in ways that no one else could. "I've been thinking about it too," I admitted. "But I want to be sure we're both approaching this for the right reasons. I don't want to confuse gratitude with something deeper. I'm not suggesting we rush into anything, but I think we owe it to ourselves to explore whether this could be something real." The relationship that developed between Amanda and me over the following months was unlike anything I had experienced. We were both in our 40s, both shaped by experiences that had taught us the value of patience and honesty. Our conversations ranged from legal strategy to personal philosophy, from shared memories of my case to dreams about the future we might build together. 6 months later, I proposed to Amanda during a quiet dinner at the same restaurant where we had first discussed taking my case. The ring I gave her had been my mother's, a simple solitaire that Helen had left me, along with her letter, hoping that someday I would find love again. "Your mother would have liked me," Amanda said as she examined the ring through tears. "She would have loved you. She always said I needed someone strong enough to keep me honest and smart enough to keep me humble." Our wedding was planned for the following spring, a small ceremony that would include Ashley and Michael, as well as Amanda's parents and siblings. The idea of starting a new family at 43 felt miraculous after losing so many years to wrongful imprisonment. But the most meaningful development in my personal life was the arrival of my granddaughter, Emma Rose. Born to Michael and Sarah 3 months after our engagement, holding that perfect little girl for the first time, seeing my son as a father, watching him cradle his daughter with a tenderness I had been unable to show him during his own infancy, completed a circle I had thought was permanently broken. "She has your stubborn chin," Michael observed as we sat in the hospital room, taking turns holding Emma while Sarah rested. "That's from your great-grandmother Helen," I told him. "She never gave up on anything, especially not on people she loved." The foundation had become more than a professional endeavor, was a calling that gave meaning to the suffering I had endured. Our most recent success story was a woman named Patricia Collins, who had served 12 years for murdering her abusive husband before new evidence proved she had been defending herself and her children from imminent danger. "I don't know how to thank you for giving me my life back," Patricia told me during our celebration dinner after her charges were dismissed. "You don't thank me," I replied. "You lived the best life you can with the freedom you've been given. That's how we honor the time that was stolen from us." David Martinez had become a regular volunteer at the foundation, using his construction skills to build transitional housing for exonerated individuals, and his personal experience to counsel clients struggling with re-entry challenges. Our relationship would never be what it had been before his fake death, but we had found a way to work together toward redemption. "I can't undo what I did to you," David told me during one of our monthly check-ins, "but I can help make sure other innocent people don't suffer the way you did." The legislation that emerged from my case, the Rivera Act, required federal agencies to immediately notify state prosecutors when they had evidence that could exonerate wrongfully convicted individuals. It also established oversight mechanisms to prevent federal law enforcement from prioritizing investigations over the constitutional rights of innocent citizens. "Your case changed how the system works," Amanda explained during a television interview about the new law. "No one will ever again be allowed to remain in prison while federal agents know they're innocent." Ashley's pregnancy announcement came 6 months after my wedding to Amanda, completing the remarkable transformation of my life from convicted murderer to exonerated grandfather-to-be. She and James were expecting their first child in late fall, giving Emma Rose a cousin who would grow up knowing their grandfather as a hero rather than a criminal. "I want my children to know their grandfather's real story," Ashley told me during a family dinner at Tom and Jennifer's house, a gathering that would have been unimaginable 3 years earlier. "I want them to understand that sometimes the system makes terrible mistakes, but that truth and justice can eventually prevail." The conversation with Jennifer that evening was our first truly comfortable interaction since my exoneration. Time and circumstances had allowed us both to find peace with the choices we had made during impossible circumstances. "I'm glad you found happiness with Amanda," Jennifer told me as we watched Emma Rose play with her cousins in the backyard. "You deserve to build a life that isn't defined by what was taken from you. And I'm glad you found happiness with Tom. You were a wonderful mother to Ashley and Michael, and they're remarkable adults because of the choices you made." The annual memorial service for my mother had become a family tradition, with Ashley, Michael, Amanda, and now the grandchildren gathering at Helen's grave to honor the woman who had never stopped believing in my innocence. This year, Emma Rose placed a small flower on her great-grandmother's headstone, while Ashley read from one of Helen's final letters. "Great-grandma, Helen, would be so proud of the family we've built," Ashley said as we stood in the desert cemetery where my mother rested. "She'd be proud that we found our way back to each other, despite everything that tried to tear us apart." As I write this final entry in the journal I've kept since my release, I'm sitting in the nursery. Amanda and I have prepared for our first child together, a son we plan to name Daniel, after the man David Martinez became during his years in hiding, but also after my father, whose memory my mother kept alive throughout my imprisonment. Tomorrow marks the 5th anniversary of my exoneration, and I'll spend it the way I spend every March 15th, visiting clients at the foundation, working on cases for other innocent people, and reminding myself that freedom is not just about walking out of prison, but about what you choose to do with the life you've been given back. I think about the boy I was before David's fake death destroyed my world, and I recognize that I'm not the same person who walked into that warehouse 15 years ago. Prison changed me, injustice shaped me, and the long fight for truth transformed me into someone I might not have become otherwise. The Marcus Rivera, who was convicted of murder, was an innocent man, but he was also naive about how easily justice could be corrupted and how quickly a life could be destroyed by lies. The Marcus Rivera, who was exonerated, is still innocent, but he's also wiser, more compassionate, and more committed to using his freedom to protect others from the system's failures. My children may never remember me as the father who raised them, but they know me as the man who survived injustice with dignity and built something meaningful from the wreckage. My grandchildren will grow up hearing stories about the grandfather who spent 15 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, but who emerged from that experience with his integrity intact and his commitment to justice stronger than ever. The truth that set me free was painful and complex, involving betrayal by people I trusted and failures by institutions I believed in, but it was still the truth. And truth, no matter how long buried or how deeply hidden, has a way of surfacing when brave people are willing to fight for it. David Martinez walked into that courtroom alive on March 15, 2024, and in doing so, he gave me back my life. But the life he returned wasn't the one I had lost. It was better, deeper, more purposeful. It was a life built on the understanding that justice isn't guaranteed, that innocence isn't always protected, but that truth, when coupled with persistence and courage, can ultimately prevail. I spent 15 years in prison for a murder that never happened, but I've spent the years since my release proving that even the darkest injustice can be transformed into a force for good, and that love, forgiveness, and hope can flourish even in the most impossible circumstances. That's the legacy I want to leave for my children and grandchildren, not the story of a man who was wrongfully convicted, but the story of a man who chose to build something beautiful from the ruins of his life.